Level 1, Horns Paradox. Imagine a quiet room where a philosopher asks, "Have you lost your horns?" The question is so peculiar, you might laugh. "I never had horns," you reply. But the philosopher smiles and says, "Then you must still have them, for you haven't lost them." At first it sounds like a joke, but this is the Horns Paradox, also known as the Horned Man, a linguistic trap woven with semantic sleight of hand. It operates on the sneaky assumption that to have lost something, you must have had it. But if you've never had horns, the phrase "you haven't lost your horns" is technically true, and yet misleading. The paradox tricks your intuition with a false presupposition, leading you to a ridiculous conclusion using entirely logical-sounding language. It's a game of logic, language, and implied meaning. You fall into its grip not because of bad reasoning, but because of hidden assumptions. The paradox is ancient, found in the writings of Greek sophists like Eubulides, who loved crafting puzzles that cornered their opponents into impossible admissions. It highlights a deeper issue in philosophical logic, how statements can be grammatically sound and yet conceptually absurd. Philosophers refer to this as a sophism, a deceptive argument that sounds logical but is built on fallacy. The Horns Paradox is essentially an early demonstration of how presupposition, the hidden assumptions built into a sentence, can be used as a weapon. In this case, the assumption is that you once had horns. If you agree you haven't lost them, the trickster uses your own words to say you still have them. You're caught in a verbal net, like a magician convincing you of something that was never real to begin with. It's not just a word game, it's a challenge to clarity itself. It teaches us that in logic, every premise matters, and even innocent-looking statements may hide unseen traps. What makes this paradox linger in your mind is not its complexity, but its simplicity. It's disarming, ridiculous, and yet oddly persuasive. Like many paradoxes, it reminds us that logic isn't always about truth. Sometimes it's about illusion. Level 2, Socratic Paradox. Socrates, the man who claimed to know nothing, remains one of the most paradoxical figures in the history of thought. At the heart of his philosophy is a single sentence that has puzzled minds for centuries: "I know that I know nothing." On the surface, it sounds humble, even wise. But step into the logic behind it, and you'll quickly realize it twists in on itself like a Mobius strip. If Socrates truly knows nothing, how can he know that he knows nothing? Isn't that something? That tiny admission, that single piece of knowledge, breaks the statement. If he knows at least one thing, then he doesn't know nothing. But if he doesn't know even that, then the statement has no basis. This creates a self-referential paradox, one that can't easily be resolved. Some scholars suggest that Socrates wasn't claiming a literal lack of knowledge, but rather pointing to the illusion of knowledge. He was saying others claim to know, but they don't. I, at least, recognize my ignorance. That recognition, paradoxically, makes him wiser. The Socratic Paradox then isn't just a puzzle, it's a challenge to arrogance. It's a reminder that certainty is often an illusion, and the wisest are those who question their own understanding. In a world obsessed with knowledge, Socrates invites us into a space of honest doubt. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that much of what we know may be assumption, tradition, or habit, not truth. And in that confrontation, we become students again, not in submission but in freedom. The paradox is profound because it turns ignorance into a form of wisdom. Not knowing becomes knowing. Uncertainty becomes clarity. In this way, the Socratic Paradox continues to unsettle, inspire, and challenge, whispering through time that the deepest knowledge may be found in asking, not answering. Level 3, Catch-22. You're a pilot in wartime. You've seen friends die, and the chaos weighs on your mind. You want out. You want to be declared insane so you can stop flying. But here's the catch. If you ask to be removed from combat because you're afraid, it proves you're sane. A truly insane person wouldn't make the request. This is Catch-22, a paradox so tightly wound that any attempt to escape becomes proof that you're trapped. Popularized by Joseph Heller's novel of the same name, Catch-22 is more than literary fiction. It's a logic loop, a closed system where reason undoes itself. At its core, it's about contradictory rules that validate each other's impossibility. You can't win because the system defines your escape as evidence of your entrapment. It's bureaucracy weaponized. Logic turned against itself. In Catch-22, to want safety is evidence you don't need it. To claim exemption is proof of eligibility's absence. It's not just about war, it's about any institution where rules contradict, and compliance becomes impossible. Think of job applications that require experience for entry-level roles, or needing credit to get credit, or the endless loop of you need ID to get ID. These are real-life Catch-22s. They trap people in cycles of absurdity. What makes this paradox so disturbing isn't just the logic, it's the powerlessness it reveals. You see the contradiction, you understand the rules, but knowing doesn't help. The trap isn't hidden, it's embedded in the structure. Catch-22 is a mirror held to systems that appear rational on the outside but collapse into madness when tested. It shows how logic misapplied or twisted by power can become cruelty. And once inside a Catch-22, all you can do is laugh or scream. Level 4. Crocodile Dilemma. A father stands on the riverbank, watching helplessly as a crocodile snatches his child. The crocodile speaks, "I will return the child only if you correctly predict what I will do next." The father, desperate, says, "You will not return my child." And now, the crocodile is trapped in a twisted loop of logic. If he returns the child, then the father's prediction was wrong, and the condition for return is unmet. But if he does not return the child, then the father's prediction was right, which means the condition is met, and the child should be returned. No matter what the crocodile does, he seems to violate the agreement. This is the Crocodile Dilemma, a paradox born from self-reference and contradictory conditions. It's a puzzle that blurs ethics, logic, and intent. The dilemma exposes how conditional promises can create logical deadlocks. Philosophers love it because it asks, can a promise be broken simply by fulfilling it, or by not fulfilling it? The paradox operates on a razor's edge, where truth and consequence collapse into contradiction. And beneath the riddle lies a chilling implication that language, so often our tool for clarity and agreement, can also be a trap. The Crocodile Dilemma echoes in courtroom oaths, paradoxical laws, and moral quandaries. It reminds us that words, when looped through self-reference, can become prisons, cages that twist meaning until no escape remains. In that way, it is not just a myth or a riddle. It is a reflection of how humans, even in their most desperate hour, can be betrayed by logic itself. Level 5. Paradox of the Court. Protagoras was a famous teacher of law. One day, a student approached him and said he wanted to learn, but couldn't pay until he won his first case. Protagoras agreed the student would pay after his first victory in court. But time passed and the student never took a case. Protagoras grew impatient and sued him. Now, a strange loop begins. If the teacher wins, the student must pay, but that would mean the student has lost his first case, and under the original contract, no payment is due. But if the student wins, he still owes nothing, because the court said so. Either way, it seems he escapes payment. This is the paradox of the court, a legal and logical tangle that pits contract against consequence. At its core, it's about recursive conditions, rules that depend on their own outcome. The paradox captures the absurdity that can emerge when obligations reference their own fulfillment. It is a legal catch-22 where logic becomes the very thing that breaks justice. Some say the student exploited a loophole, others say the teacher was right to press the issue. But no judgment feels complete because any ruling destroys itself. In this way, the paradox of the court reminds us that not all justice is logical, and not all logic is just. It shows how human systems built on language, agreement, and law can fall into loops that no verdict can untangle. The more you reason, the less resolution you find. And that perhaps is the most unsettling truth of all. Level 6. Omnipotence Paradox. Imagine an all-powerful being, a deity with no limits, capable of doing anything. Now ask, can this being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If yes, then there is something it cannot do, lift the stone. If no, then there's something it cannot do, create the stone. Either answer seems to strip the being of omnipotence. This is the Omnipotence Paradox, a puzzle that forces us to confront the very boundaries of power. On the surface, it's a childlike riddle, but at its core, it's a devastating critique of language and limits. Omnipotence implies total ability to do anything, to override any law, but anything includes contradictions. The problem is that creating an unliftable stone is not a reasonable task. It's a logical impossibility wrapped in words. Philosophers like Aquinas and Descartes debated whether omnipotence includes the ability to do the logically impossible. If it does, the concept becomes absurd. The being could create square circles or true lies. If it doesn't, then omnipotence is already limited. The paradox reveals that absolute power may be incoherent, not because power has limits, but because logic itself might. It's a window into how language can trick the mind, making impossibilities sound like actions. The paradox isn't just theological, it applies to any system of total control, any attempt to define ultimate authority. It tells us that the notion of boundless power must be met with caution, because within that idea may lie the seeds of self-destruction. In the silence that follows the paradox, we begin to sense that even the infinite has shape, and even omnipotence must bow to reason, or cease to be anything at all. Level 7. Opposite Day Paradox. Children play with the idea of an opposite day, a day when everything means its reverse. Yes becomes no, hot becomes cold. But then someone says, today is opposite day, and suddenly the game collapses. If the statement is true, then today is opposite day, but that would make the statement false. And if it's false, then it is an opposite day, which would make the statement true. This is the Opposite Day Paradox, a playful yet profound loop of language and meaning. What begins as a game turns into a philosophical trap. The paradox is self-referential. It eats its own tail. It highlights how meaning depends not just on what is said, but the context and assumptions behind it. We depend on shared definitions to communicate, and when those definitions reverse, even momentarily, everything unravels. The paradox lies at the intersection of semantics and truth. Like the Lear Paradox, it loops between being and not being, between truth and its negation. If opposite day exists as a stable rule, then declaring it creates instability. The system breaks under its own rules. In real life, we see shades of this in irony, sarcasm, and coded speech, where meaning is intentionally inverted. But if everything is inverted, there's no stable reference point. The paradox whispers something deeper, that communication requires consistency. Without it, we can't even agree on disagreement. It's not just a child's joke, it's a philosophical mirror. In it, we glimpse the fragility of meaning, and how easily logic can collapse when its foundations shift beneath our words. Level 8, Barber Paradox. In a small town lives a barber. He shaves all the men who do not shave themselves, and only those. So the question arises, does the barber shave himself? If he does, then by rule he should not. But if he doesn't, then by rule he must. This is the Barber Paradox, a simple story that exposes a logical inconsistency hidden in the structure of sets and definitions. First proposed by Bertrand Russell, it is actually a reformulation of his more abstract set-theoretic paradox. The Barber Paradox creates a contradiction by defining a group in terms of a rule that cannot consistently apply to every member. The moment the barber becomes part of his own rule, the rule breaks. It's like a snake eating its own tail. The logic turns inward and collapses. The lesson is subtle but powerful. Some definitions create contradictions not because they are false, but because they're impossible. They demand a truth value where none can exist. The barber becomes a symbol of how self-reference can destabilize entire systems. In mathematics and logic, this led to the downfall of naive set theory and the rise of stricter axiomatic approaches. But beyond math, the paradox resonates as a reminder that not all systems can be complete and consistent. Some questions, like whether the barber shaves himself, are unanswerable, not due to lack of knowledge, but due to the limits of the system itself. The paradox quietly asks, what happens when the rule becomes the exception? When the definer becomes the defined? And in that question, we glimpse the boundaries of logic itself. Level 9. Epimenides Paradox. A man stands and declares all Cretans are liars. His name is Epimenides, and he is a Cretan. The words hang in the air, folded in contradiction. If what he says is true, then he, a Cretan, is lying, which makes the statement false. But if it's false, then not all Cretans are liars, which could make the statement true. This is the Epimenides Paradox, an ancient version of the Lear Paradox, dressed in ethnic generalization but cloaked in deeper logic. What makes this paradox powerful is not just its circularity, but its subtle ambiguity. It dances between universal and existential claims. Does all Cretans are liars mean every Cretan always lies, or just that they cannot be trusted? Either interpretation leads us into a tangle of self-reference. If the speaker is part of the set he's describing, his truth value affects the truth of the statement itself. The paradox shows that language is not always a stable vessel for meaning. It can twist back on itself, casting doubt even on declarations that seem simple. The Epimenides Paradox becomes a seed for entire fields of logic and semantics. It prefigures Gödel's incompleteness, Tarski's undefinability of truth, and modern theories of linguistic recursion. In it, we see that truth is not always linear. Sometimes it is a circle, beautiful, frustrating, and eternal. Level 10, Lear Paradox. This sentence is false. 6 words. That's all it takes to unravel the fabric of logic. If the sentence is true, then it must be false, just as it says. But if it's false, then it must be true. The Lear Paradox is a perfect loop, a sentence that devours itself with no escape. It's one of the oldest known paradoxes, dating back to ancient Greece, and yet it remains one of the most troubling. On the surface, it feels like a word trick, but go deeper, and you find it shakes the foundations of logic itself. How do we assign truth to a statement that depends on its own falsehood? The paradox is more than a riddle. It's a mirror held up to the nature of truth. It has inspired everything from medieval scholastics to modern formal logic. It reveals the cracks in any system that tries to define truth from within. If we allow statements to refer to their own truth value, contradictions may emerge. This led to the development of hierarchical language theories, systems that separate statements from the levels at which they can be evaluated. But no matter how we try to resolve it, the Lear Paradox whispers a haunting truth that not all questions have answers, and not all systems are safe from collapse. It reminds us that even the most basic seeming statement can open an abyss. And once you stare into it, it stares back silently, endlessly, eternally false, and eternally true. Level 11, Card Paradox, Jourdain's card. Imagine holding a card in your hand. One side reads, the statement on the other side of this card is true. You flip it over. The reverse says, the statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the loop begins. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true. But the second side says the first is false. That creates a contradiction. But if the first side is false, then the second side must be false too, meaning the first is true. And so it cycles endlessly. This is the card paradox, a beautifully compact version of the Lear Paradox, played across the front and back of a single object. It's a riddle with no stable solution. A truth loop that collapses on itself with every turn. What makes the card paradox so disarming is how physical it is. Not a theory or a thought experiment, but something you could print, hold, and still not resolve. It forces you to confront the instability of truth in systems that allow self-reference. The contradiction isn't in your reasoning, it's built into the structure of the statements themselves. It's a paradox that teaches humility. Not every problem can be solved by deeper thought. Some are broken by design. And in that realization lies something deeply philosophical. The card paradox is a mirror for the limits of logic, showing us that even simple sentences, when looped just right, can destroy certainty. Level 12, NoNo Paradox. Here are 2 sentences. The first says, the next sentence is not true. The second says, the previous sentence is not true. At first, they seem like harmless statements, circular perhaps, but readable. Then you try to determine their truth. If the first sentence is true, then the second must be false. But if the second is false, then the first sentence is not untrue, it must be false too. That's a contradiction. If instead the first is false, then the second must be true. But the second says the first is not true, which matches what we assumed. But now the first is false and the second is true, which again supports the second's claim. Yet somehow, the entire structure feels unstable. This is the NoNo Paradox, a tangled web of mutual denial, where two statements lean on each other in a delicate balance of contradiction. It's a variation of the Lear Paradox, but this time the lie is passed back and forth between two voices. Like two mirrors facing each other, the reflection becomes infinite, a recursive denial that never lands on stable ground. What makes the NoNo Paradox so subtle is how reasonable it feels at first. It's only when you step back that you realize the structure is impossible. Each sentence tries to escape being false by placing the blame on the other, and in doing so, both fall into a logical abyss. It's a reminder that systems built on denial can't stand forever. They collapse inward, leaving only the echo of contradiction behind. Level 13. Pinocchio Paradox. Pinocchio stands on the wooden floor of Geppetto's shop, his nose twitching, and he declares, "My nose is growing now." But his nose only grows when he lies. So what happens? If he's telling the truth, his nose should not grow, which means the statement is false. But if it's false, then he's lying and his nose should grow, which makes the statement true. This is the Pinocchio Paradox, a charming yet profound twist on the Lear Paradox, rooted in fiction but piercingly real in its logic. Unlike the classical Lear Paradox, this one adds a physical consequence. A lie triggers growth, but the statement refers to that very event in real time. The feedback loop it creates is immediate, visible, and irreconcilable. What makes the Pinocchio Paradox so powerful is that it brings abstract contradiction into the realm of storytelling. It's a moment where logic and narrative fuse, where a fictional world reflects real philosophical depth. The paradox also shows how even fantasy can expose the flaws in how we think about truth. By embedding the lie in a statement about its own effect, it turns a puppet into a philosopher. And perhaps that's the lesson, that truth is not always as simple as true or false. Sometimes it grows before your eyes, spiraling into something that cannot be contained. Level 14. Quinns Paradox. Consider a sentence that doesn't directly refer to itself, yet somehow still traps itself in contradiction. Here's one: yields falsehood when appended to its own quotation, yields falsehood when appended to its own quotation. This is Quinns Paradox, a self-referential loop without the usual markers of self-reference. It hides the mirror, but the reflection remains. The sentence refers to itself obliquely, through structure rather than direct naming. It creates a loop by describing a process, appending a phrase to its own quote, and then performing that process. The result is a paradox that doesn't look like one until you follow the path it lays. What makes Quinns Paradox especially disturbing is its elegance. It shows that you don't need the phrase "this sentence" to build a Lear paradox. You only need a clever construction, one that reflects back on itself through action rather than identity. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. Quinns Paradox reveals that self-reference is deeper than it seems. It can hide in processes, structures, and instructions. And when it does, it becomes even harder to spot and even harder to solve. In this way, the paradox stretches the boundaries of what we mean by self. It suggests that anything can become paradoxical if it is built to observe itself. Even language, which was to explain the world, can sometimes tie itself in knots so tight that no truth can escape. Level 15. Bhartrhari's Paradox. A philosopher from ancient India poses a riddle. There are things that are unnameable. It seems innocent, even insightful. But consider what's being said. If something is unnameable, how can it be named as unnameable? The very act of stating it, of speaking the sentence, seems to disprove the claim. This is Bhartrhari's Paradox, a deep and ancient reflection on language, meaning, and contradiction. It doesn't shout like other paradoxes, it whispers. But in that whisper is a profound unease. The paradox arises from the conflict between what is said and what is meant. If unnameable things exist, and we can talk about them, then they are not truly unnameable. But if we can't talk about them, then how is the sentence even formed? The contradiction lies not in logic, but in language. Bhartrhari's paradox challenges the very act of naming. In doing so, it foreshadows modern problems in semantics and reference. It also echoes mystical traditions which speak of truths beyond language, realities that cannot be spoken without distortion. The paradox becomes a philosophical koan, a statement that breaks the mind open rather than closes it with certainty. It reminds us that language is not a perfect mirror of reality. Sometimes, in trying to say too much, it reveals its own limits. And in that moment when language collapses under its own weight, we glimpse the silence beyond words, the unnameable. Level 16. Barber Paradox. Consider this phrase, the smallest number not nameable in under 10 words. It seems to point to a specific number, the smallest one that no brief phrase can describe. But wait. That very phrase is only 9 words long. If it names such a number, then the number has now been named in under 10 words, which contradicts its own definition. This is the Barber Paradox, a quiet explosion inside language and logic. It was introduced by G.G. Barry and later discussed by Bertrand Russell, and it exposes a fundamental instability in the idea of definability. It seems innocent at first, a play of description and counting, but it quickly collapses into contradiction. The heart of the paradox lies in the attempt to define something by what it cannot be, a kind of linguistic negative space. We often assume we can refer to anything by simply describing it, even abstractly. But the Barber Paradox reveals that the act of describing something in terms of its indescribability leads to self-contradiction. It's similar to trying to point at a place you claim can't be pointed at. Language, in this case, builds a trap for itself. The paradox raises unsettling questions about formal systems, language limits, and the very possibility of compressing meaning into finite structures. It led directly to developments in computability, complexity theory, and the exploration of Gödel-type limitations. What's haunting is how casually the paradox arises. A simple phrase, a short definition, and suddenly we've broken logic. The Barber Paradox reminds us that definitions are not always stable, and that meaning, when stretched too tightly, tears along its own edges. Level 17. Richard's Paradox. In a dusty corner of mathematical logic, a paradox quietly sits, Richard's Paradox. It begins with a clever idea. Consider all the real numbers that can be defined in a finite number of English words. There are only countably many such definitions, yet there are uncountably many real numbers. So most real numbers are undefinable. But then, define the smallest real number that cannot be defined in fewer than 13 English words. That sentence is 12 words long. So it seems to define a number that shouldn't be definable. The contradiction is immediate and jarring. We have defined something that, by its very definition, should not be definable. Richard's paradox isn't just a puzzle, it's a fundamental challenge to the way language interacts with mathematics. It shows that language, even formal language, is slippery. That definitions, when too clever, can spiral into contradiction. The paradox reveals how trying to classify everything, even just using descriptions, can backfire. It echoes the Barber Paradox and anticipates problems in formal logic, set theory, and computability. It led logicians like Russell, Gödel, and Turing to look deeper into the foundations of mathematics. Richard's paradox whispers that even the act of naming is fraught with paradox. That clarity, when taken to extremes, breeds confusion, and that within the very effort to organize reality, we may create cracks where certainty cannot survive. It's a lesson not just in math, but in humility, a reminder that the map is not the territory, and the names we give can unravel if we hold them too tightly. Level 18. Königs Paradox. At the heart of Königs Paradox lies a confrontation between two infinities. Imagine trying to list all the real numbers that can be defined by finite expressions. That list, by its nature, is countable. Each definition can be represented by a finite string, but the real numbers themselves are uncountable. So there must be real numbers that can't be defined, numbers that lie beyond language. But now consider this, let's define the first undefinable real number. That's a paradox, because by naming it as the first undefinable, we have just defined it. It now has a label, a position in language, so it isn't undefinable after all. But then, what does that mean? This paradox was formulated by Julius König in the early 20th century, and it pierces to the heart of mathematical logic and set theory. It forces us to confront the difference between naming and existing, between description and essence. Königs paradox is closely related to Richard's and Barry's, a trilogy of definitional contradictions that expose the fragile interface between language and quantity. What it teaches is that not everything that exists in theory can be grasped by expression. That some truths, some numbers, some realities are beyond the reach of words, and that the moment we claim to catch them, they slip away. Königs paradox doesn't just trouble mathematicians. It troubles philosophers. It suggests that infinity isn't just large, it's unknowable in parts. And that in trying to name the unnameable, we tie ourselves in loops that no sentence can straighten. Level 19. Grelling Paradox. Let's take a moment to think about adjectives, words that describe things. Some adjectives describe themselves. Short is a short word. English is an English word. These are called autological. Others don't describe themselves. Long is not a long word. French is not a French word. These are called heterological. Now here's the paradox. Is the word heterological? If it is, then it does not describe itself, but then it must be heterological, which means it does describe itself. That's a contradiction. But if it is not heterological, that is, if it does describe itself, then it must be autological. But heterological means it does not describe itself. That's another contradiction. This is the Grelling Paradox. It's a version of Russell's paradox, applied not to sets, but to language. What makes it especially troubling is how ordinary it feels at first, a simple question about adjectives. But quickly it collapses into logical chaos. The paradox reveals that language is not always a safe tool. When words are allowed to refer to themselves in classification, trouble follows. It forces a distinction between use and mention, between a word and the thing it describes. The Grelling Paradox shows that even categories can eat themselves if not carefully defined. And it reminds us that in every language there are corners we cannot light, edges where reason frays into silence. Level 20. Drinker Paradox. In a crowded pub, surrounded by laughter and drinks, a quiet piece of logic hides in plain sight. The statement is this: there is someone in this pub such that if they are drinking, then everyone in the pub is drinking. It sounds absurd. How could one person's action determine everyone else's? But this is the drinker paradox, and it's not only true, it's probably true under classical logic. Here's how it works. Suppose no one is drinking. Then the statement holds vacuously, because if the person is drinking, which they're not, everyone else is too. That's classical implication. If the premise is false, the implication is true. Now suppose at least one person is drinking. Choose that person. If they are drinking, then everyone is drinking, at least that person, which is enough to satisfy the condition. Either way, the paradoxical statement is always logically valid. It's not a trick, it's a feature of how implication works in formal systems. But our intuition rebels. We imagine the statement must mean something stronger, that it implies connection, control, causality. But it doesn't. The paradox reveals a gap between logic and intuition. It's a quiet demonstration that truth in the world of logic doesn't always feel true. The drinker paradox stands as a reminder that in the pursuit of understanding, we must sometimes abandon comfort. That logic, for all its beauty, can lead us down paths where common sense cannot follow. And that truth, in its purest. Level 21, Paradox of Entailment. In classical logic, there's a strange and unsettling rule: from a contradiction, anything follows. It's known as ex falso quod libet, or from falsehood, whatever you please. Suppose you accept a contradiction, like it is raining, and it is not raining. From that moment onward, logic allows you to infer anything: that unicorns exist, that the moon is made of cheese, or that tomorrow is yesterday. This is the paradox of entailment. It's not a puzzle in the usual sense. It's a feature of formal logic that reveals something deeply unintuitive. When systems admit contradictions, they collapse into absurdity. Everything becomes provable. And if everything is provable, then nothing means anything. Logic, once the guardian of truth, becomes a floodplain where every idea, no matter how false, is suddenly valid. This paradox sits at the heart of debates about consistency and completeness in mathematics and philosophy. It's one of the reasons why consistency is treated with such reverence in formal systems. A single contradiction acts like a virus, spreading through proofs, infecting every corner. The paradox also poses a challenge to our intuitions about reasoning. Most of us believe that some things follow naturally, others do not. But in the presence of contradiction, all lines blur. It's a humbling reminder that logic, for all its clarity, can become chaos if even a single axiom falters. And it whispers a deeper truth: that stability, coherence, and meaning are not guaranteed. They must be protected from the inside out. Level 22, Material Implication Paradox, Vacuous Truth. In the realm of formal logic, the phrase "if P, then Q" is considered true whenever P is false, no matter what Q says. This is called material implication, and it gives rise to a peculiar kind of truth known as a vacuous truth. Here's an example: if the moon is made of cheese, then 225. According to material implication, that sentence is technically true, because the premise is false. But something in you recoils. It doesn't feel true. It feels nonsensical. This is the material implication paradox, a divide between formal logic and human intuition. In our everyday reasoning, if then implies causation or connection. But in propositional logic, it's only a relation of truth values. No relationship is needed, just the structure. If the antecedent is false, the whole implication is true, regardless of the conclusion. This leads to bewildering results and makes logic feel alien. How can something obviously absurd be classified as true? The paradox reveals that logic is built not on meaning, but on structure. It also shows that language, when pulled into formal systems, can behave in unexpected ways. The paradox doesn't expose a flaw in logic. It shows a gap between logic and language, between symbol and sense. And in that gap, we're forced to ask, what do we mean by truth? Is it a technical property? Or is it something more lived, more intuitive, more felt? The answer may depend not on rules, but on how you choose to reason in a world where rules sometimes defy reality. Level 23, Ross's Paradox, Imperipate Inference. You're told, you should mail the letter. That seems like a clear directive. But in classical logic, you're also allowed to infer, you should mail the letter or burn it. That second statement feels wrong, almost sinister, and yet logically it's valid. This is Ross's paradox, a problem that arises when we apply the rules of formal logic to imperatives, commands, obligations, duties. The paradox shows that adding options, even absurd or dangerous ones, can preserve logical truth but destroy the meaning of the original statement. The logical operation here is disjunction, the or statement. In formal logic, if you should mail the letter is true, then you should mail the letter or do anything else is also true. But in language, in ethics, in life, that doesn't hold. Adding or burn it completely changes the meaning. Ross's paradox reveals the limits of applying propositional logic to moral reasoning or normative language. It tells us that meaning is not just about what can be inferred, it's about what is intended. Commands are not the same as facts. Their logic must include not only structure but context, tone, and purpose. Ross's paradox also whispers something deeper, that clarity and expression isn't the same as clarity and intent, and that our reasoning, if stripped of nuance, can become monstrous. Even truth, if formalized too rigidly, can become dangerous. We are reminded here that logic is powerful, but without care, that power can twist messages into something unrecognizable. Level 24, Free Choice Paradox. But suppose someone says, you may have an apple or an orange. Most of us interpret that to mean you may have an apple and you may have an orange. Each option feels granted individually. But in modal logic, the logic of possibility and permission, this inference is not so simple. The free choice paradox arises from this disjunction of permissions. The sentence, you may have an apple or an orange, does not formally entail that you may have either one individually. The logical structure does not allow breaking apart the permission, but our intuition insists otherwise. This gap between logic and language creates tension. We feel as though the permission covers both fruits, and yet, strictly speaking, it may not. The paradox isn't just about food, it's about the way we interpret rights, freedoms, and obligations. It shows that language often suggests more than logic can formally allow. Or in natural language feels inclusive, it feels like choice. But in logic, disjunction is a blunt instrument. The free choice paradox reveals that our everyday reasoning depends on subtleties of expectation, social norms, and implied context that formal systems cannot easily replicate. It reminds us that logic needs more than truth values. It needs a connection to meaning. And that in trying to define freedom, we may discover that even choice has limits, not in action, but in expression. Level 25, Lottery Paradox. Imagine a giant lottery with millions of tickets. You know rationally that any given ticket will almost certainly lose. You believe this for each ticket, yet you also believe correctly that one ticket must win. This is the lottery paradox. It's not about numbers or odds, it's about belief. You hold a large set of individually rational beliefs, ticket 1 will lose, ticket 2 will lose, and so on. But taken together, these beliefs become collectively irrational, because one of them must be false. The paradox shows that rationality doesn't always scale. That what seems reasonable in isolation can collapse into contradiction in total. It challenges our assumptions about consistency in belief. Should we reject some of our beliefs? Should we refuse to believe anything with high probability unless it's certain? Or should we accept the inconsistency and live with it? The paradox has deep implications for epistemology, the study of knowledge. It reveals that belief, probability, and truth are not as neatly aligned as we imagine. In life, we often act on near certainty, knowing we might be wrong. The lottery paradox captures that unease. It reminds us that belief is not binary, it's graded, fragile, and sometimes paradoxical. And it teaches us that rationality is not a destination. It's a balance, a dance, a negotiation between what we know, what we feel, and what we choose to believe. Level 26, Preface Paradox. An author finishes a massive book, meticulously researched, each chapter filled with detailed arguments, facts, and citations. Before the main text begins, they include a preface. Despite my confidence in every statement in this book, I suspect at least one may be wrong. It's not humility, it's honesty. Every individual claim is believed, yet the author also believes that, collectively, the book likely contains an error. This tension is the preface paradox, the clash between holding beliefs individually and holding beliefs about a whole system of those beliefs. It questions how rational belief functions. Can we reasonably believe each piece of a puzzle while also believing the entire puzzle contains a flaw? The paradox suggests yes and no. You trust every fact on its own, yet also trust the experience that tells you no large work is ever perfect. In epistemology, this is called epistemic inconsistency, and it's not a mistake, it reflects how human cognition works in layers. The paradox forces us to reconsider whether we need absolute consistency in our beliefs. In real life, we live with this paradox all the time, when reading news, trusting science, even navigating relationships. We believe in the parts, while staying cautious about the whole. Philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox by redefining belief. Perhaps it's not binary, but scalar, with varying degrees of confidence. Or perhaps we can distinguish between first-order beliefs, this fact is true, and second-order beliefs, my belief system may be flawed. Either way, the preface paradox doesn't reveal a contradiction. It reveals a subtle harmony between conviction and doubt. It reminds us that wisdom is not the absence of uncertainty, but the grace to carry it without collapsing under its weight. Level 27, Raven Paradox. You walk into a field and see a black raven. It confirms, in a small way, the general rule: all ravens are black. That makes sense. But now you see a green apple. Surprisingly, this also supports the same rule, and here's why. The statement "all ravens are black" is logically equivalent to "all non-black things are non-ravens." A green apple is a non-black non-raven, so observing it technically supports the statement. This is Hempel's paradox, or the Raven Paradox, and it illustrates the strangeness of confirmation theory. It challenges our assumptions about evidence. While logic treats all confirming instances equally, our intuition rebels. But logic insists they are. The paradox exposes a disconnect between our intuitive and formal understandings of confirmation. Philosophers have tried to resolve it by invoking relevance, the idea that some evidence, while technically confirming, is practically worthless. Others use probability. Yes, a green apple increases our confidence infinitesimally, but a black raven does so substantially more. The Raven Paradox teaches us something important. Evidence is not just about logical structure, but about meaningful connections. It invites us to consider the quality of confirmation, not just its quantity. It shows that even in science, data must be interpreted, not just counted. And in that, it reveals the delicate dance between logic and common sense, between the cold clarity of deduction and the warm messiness of human understanding. Level 28. Temperature Paradox. Imagine a scenario where you enter a cold room and a scientist tells you every object here is getting warmer. You watch the thermometer, it reads 5 degrees Celsius, then 5.1, then 5.2. Clearly, the room is warming up. But then you realize the thermometer itself is getting warmer too. Its readings are rising because it is heating up, not necessarily because the environment is. So, is the room really getting warmer? Or is the tool used to measure warmth giving a distorted signal? This is the essence of the temperature paradox. It's a variation on the problem of reference frames and relative measurement, often invoked in discussions about epistemology and physics. The paradox arises when the tool of measurement is itself part of the system being measured. It creates a feedback loop, a situation where objectivity is undermined from within. In broader philosophical terms, this echoes the observer effect, the idea that measuring something changes the system itself. The temperature paradox teaches a deeper truth, that no measurement is immune to context. When the thermometer is reliable, its readings mean something. But when the thermometer is itself affected by the system it observes, every reading must be taken with doubt. The paradox doesn't just apply to temperature. It applies to perception, politics, morality, any system where the standard of judgment is not fixed. It whispers that objectivity is always partial, that to know something fully we must stand outside it, but to live we are always inside. It leaves us with a haunting lesson. Beware of mistaking rising numbers for rising truth. Level 29. The Unexpected Hanging Paradox. A judge tells a condemned prisoner, "You will be hanged at noon one day next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day until the hour comes." The prisoner thinks hard. It can't be Friday. If he's still alive Thursday night, he'll expect it Friday. That won't be a surprise. Then it can't be Thursday, because if Friday is ruled out and he's alive Wednesday night, he'll expect it Thursday. This logic continues until the prisoner rules out every day of the week. Convinced he will not be hanged, he relaxes. Then, on Wednesday, the executioner arrives. The prisoner is stunned, completely surprised. The judge's promise is fulfilled. This is the unexpected hanging paradox, and it reveals the paradoxical nature of predicting surprise. The prisoner's reasoning seems sound, and yet it leads to a false conclusion. The execution still occurs, and it's still unexpected. The paradox illustrates the limitations of logical reasoning about knowledge, especially second-order knowledge, knowing what you will or won't know. Philosophers use it to explore epistemic logic, self-reference, and even temporal reasoning. Some argue the paradox is linguistic, that the word surprise breaks down under scrutiny. Others suggest that by trying to predict the prediction, the prisoner collapses the very structure he's trying to map. The deeper truth is that surprise resists formalization. The future, when intertwined with your own awareness of it, becomes unstable. The unexpected hanging is not just a story, it's a philosophical trapdoor. The more you analyze, the less you know. And that's exactly what makes the hammer fall so quietly. Level 30, Quinns Paradox. This sentence is true, and if it's true, then unicorns exist. It seems absurd, but logic compels you to follow. If the sentence is true, then the condition, if this sentence is true, is fulfilled, and therefore the consequence, unicorns exist, must also be true. You've just proven the existence of unicorns, from a sentence about itself. This is Quinns Paradox, and it's one of the most dangerous paradoxes in logic. It doesn't use contradiction like the Lear Paradox. It doesn't invoke falsity. It simply leverages implication and self-reference to create a system where anything can be proven, even obvious falsehoods. In naive logic, this destroys consistency. The paradox appears in systems that allow self-referential conditionals, statements that declare something about themselves and then leap to arbitrary conclusions. In set theory, it can be expressed through sets that contain themselves under a condition. In natural language, it emerges through indirect implication. The danger of Quinns Paradox is that it bypasses contradiction entirely. It doesn't say this is false. It says if untrue, then X, and then forces the system to accept X. Logicians avoid this paradox by restricting the kinds of self-reference allowed in formal systems. But the deeper message is about the fragility of truth. That implication, often considered safe and logical, becomes a trap when pointed inward. The paradox teaches us that systems must be built with caution, that freedom to say anything must come with rules about how those statements relate. Otherwise, logic becomes a wish machine, not a tool for truth, but a factory of fiction dressed in certainty. Level 31. The NoNo Paradox. Somewhere in a logic textbook or a philosophical dialogue, the sentence appears. This sentence is not known to be true. At first, it seems innocent, just a simple statement about knowledge. But then you start to examine it more closely. If the sentence is true, then what it says must hold, that it is not known to be true. So we have a true statement that is not known, which seems fine. But if we were to know that this sentence is true, then we would also know that it is not known, which creates a contradiction. This is the NoNo Paradox, and it arises from applying epistemic logic about knowledge, to self-referential claims. Like the Lear Paradox, it forms a strange loop by talking about its own truth status. It destabilizes the very system it occupies. The paradox challenges the idea that every truth can be known, or that a system can be both complete and fully self-aware. In formal epistemology, this leads to troubling questions. Can knowledge be closed under logical consequence? Can a truth be accessible without collapsing into contradiction? One way out is to deny factivity, the assumption that if something is known, then it must be true. Another is to limit the kinds of self-reference allowed in epistemic language. But the deeper lesson here is that knowing something is not a neutral act. It is dynamic, recursive, and vulnerable to collapse. The NoNo Paradox whispers that awareness has limits, not just practical, but structural. And in trying to know all truths, we might unknow ourselves. Level 32. Fich's Paradox of Knowability. Suppose every truth is, in principle, knowable. That feels reasonable. It means nothing is hidden beyond the reach of understanding, only perhaps undiscovered for now. But then a strange argument begins. If every truth is knowable, then every truth must also be known. How can that be? There are clearly truths we do not currently know. Fich's paradox begins with this innocent assumption that all truths are knowable, and leads us to the radical conclusion that all truths must already be known. This conclusion feels impossible. So what went wrong? The paradox lies in how we handle mode logic, the logic of possibility and necessity, especially when combined with epistemic claims. If we suppose that a truth is not currently known but could be known, and we allow logical closure over known truths, then we arrive at contradiction. Either not all truths are knowable, or some truths are unknowable, or our assumptions about knowledge must change. Philosophers have tried various escape routes. Some limit the kind of truths allowed in the proof, others suggest a difference between possible and principle and logically possible. Still others reject that knowability should imply actual knowledge. The paradox resonates beyond logic into science, consciousness, and metaphysics. It questions the idea of potential knowledge, and whether the unknown is truly reachable or forever receding. Fich's paradox reminds us that epistemic optimism, the idea that truth is always within reach, may be logically unsustainable. It suggests that the act of knowing reshapes what can be known, and that some truths may flicker just beyond the horizon, not because they hide, but because we looked too closely. Level 33, Moore's Paradox. I went to the store yesterday, but I don't believe that I did. That sentence, spoken aloud, feels wrong, not false necessarily, but absurd. This is Moore's Paradox, named after philosopher G.E. Moore. The paradox lies not in contradiction, but in what's called pragmatic inconsistency, the clash between the content of a statement and the act of asserting it. If you say something, you implicitly claim to believe it. So saying it's raining, but I don't believe it's raining undermines itself, not logically, but functionally. It breaks the rules of communication. The paradox extends into belief as well. You can believe that it's raining, or believe that you don't believe it's raining, but holding both together creates a kind of cognitive noise. Moore's paradox has been studied in epistemology, philosophy of mind, and even AI. It reveals how belief is more than a static state. It's tied to action, speech, and credibility. When we say something, we engage in more than transfer of facts. We express alignment with a world, a self, a stance. This paradox teaches that rational thought isn't only about avoiding contradiction, it's about making sense, internally and externally. Moore's insight reaches deep. We are not only thinkers but speakers, not only minds but social beings. And in that space between logic and expression, paradoxes like this remind us how fragile coherence truly is. A sentence can be grammatically sound, logically valid, yet still tear at the fabric of understanding. Level 34, the Hooded Man Paradox. You're told this: the hooded man is someone you do not know. Later you find out the hooded man was your own brother. But you know your brother, don't you? Then how can it be true that the hooded man is someone you do not know? This is the Hooded Man Paradox, and it turns on the tension between knowledge and identity. Specifically, it reveals the limitations of substitutivity in knowledge contexts. If you know X, Y, then statements about X and Y should be interchangeable. But in practice, they often aren't. This is known as the failure of Leibniz's law in epistemic logic. You know your brother, but you don't know that your brother is the hooded man, so the substitution collapses. The paradox shows that knowledge isn't just about reference, but about modes of presentation. You know your brother under one name, one role, one context. But in another context, as the hooded man, he's a stranger. Philosophers have long wrestled with this, from Frege's distinction between sense and reference to modern formal semantics. The Hooded Man Paradox matters because it reveals that knowledge is perspectival. What you know depends on how you know it, and what lens you use. In legal theory, ethics, and artificial intelligence, this problem appears in disguise. Who knew what, when, and under which label? The paradox reminds us that recognition is not just about facts, it's about framing. And sometimes the face we fail to see is not because we never knew it, but because it wore a different name. Level 35, Sorites Paradox. You have a pile of sand. You remove a single grain. It's still a pile. Remove another, still a pile. But continue this one grain at a time, and eventually you're left with just one grain. Is that still a pile? Probably not. But where did the transition happen? Which grain was the tipping point? This is the Sorites Paradox, from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. It's a paradox of vagueness where the boundaries of concepts are blurred. The problem applies to many real-world cases. When does a person become bald? When does someone become old? When does night become day? The paradox exposes the difficulty of drawing sharp lines in a world of soft transitions. Some philosophers propose supervaluationism, the idea that vague terms don't have precise boundaries, but their use can still be meaningful through admissible precisifications. Others use fuzzy logic, allowing degrees of truth instead of binary true-false values. But the paradox remains powerful because it forces us to confront the limits of language. Human categories are not perfect mirrors of reality, they're tools shaped by needs and habits. The Sorites Paradox teaches humility. That many of our certainties rest on vague edges. That logic, when applied with absolute precision to imprecise terms, creates cracks. It shows us that not all problems can be solved by finding a missing grain, because perhaps there was never a final grain at all. Just a slow fading, from many to few, from clear to unclear, from pile to puzzle. Level 36, Plato's Beard. Try to deny the existence of something, say unicorns. In order to deny them, you must speak of them. You must say, unicorns do not exist. But by doing so, you seem to assign them a kind of being, at least enough to refer to them. This is Plato's beard, a phrase coined by W.V.O. Quine to describe the paradox that non-being must in some sense be in order to be talked about. It's a tangled philosophical problem, one that Plato himself confronted in the Sophist. How can we meaningfully speak of what is not, without inadvertently granting it existence? If we say Pegasus does not exist, we are talking about Pegasus, but if Pegasus does not exist, what are we talking about? The paradox touches language, logic, ontology, and even mathematics. It's the foundation of discussions of doubt, negative existentials, and it complicates our understanding of truth, reference, and negation. One solution is Meinong's theory, which posits that some things like round squares or golden mountains have a kind of non-existent being. Another is Russell's theory of definite descriptions, where phrases like the current king of France is bald are analyzed to dissolve the paradox. But Plato's beard continues to prick. It reminds us that speaking of nothing is never nothing. That language pulls concepts into a sort of twilight, not fully real, not fully unreal. And it warns us that even negation carries the weight of presence. In trying to shave away the beard of being, we find that the blade cannot cut without naming what it cuts. Level 37, NoNo Paradox. Socrates asks a troubling question in Plato's dialogue, Meno. How can you search for knowledge of something when you don't know what it is? If you know what you're looking for, you don't need to search. If you don't know, how will you recognize it when you find it? This is NoNo Paradox, and it challenges the very idea of learning. It seems to trap us between ignorance and recognition. If we know nothing, we can learn nothing, because nothing can guide us toward truth. Socrates responds with the doctrine of anamnesis, that the soul already knows all truths from past lives, and learning is simply recollection. But even if we discard reincarnation, the paradox remains haunting. It questions how discovery works. In science, in art, in philosophy, how do we know when we've uncovered something real? How does a child first come to understand the concept of justice or beauty if they've never encountered it? One solution is to suggest we don't start with nothing, we start with partial knowledge, with fragments. We begin in a fog and slowly shapes emerge. The paradox then isn't fatal, it's a mirror of our journey. NoNo Paradox teaches that the path to understanding is neither blind nor certain. It's guided by intuition, by metaphor, by trial and error. And it reminds us that learning is a leap, not from ignorance to knowledge, but from not knowing yet to knowing better. In that space of paradox, we become seekers. And in seeking, we define the unknown by the light we shine into it. Level 38, Munchausen Trilemma. You're asked to justify a belief, you provide a reason. Then you're asked to justify that reason. This continues until you face three options: circular reasoning, infinite regress, or dogmatic assumption. This is the Munchausen Trilemma, named after the baron who claimed to pull himself out of a swamp by his own hair. It's a powerful critique of epistemology, the study of knowledge, showing that any chain of justification must either loop, stretch forever, or stop arbitrarily. None of these seems satisfying. Circular reasoning feels dishonest. Infinite regress never finishes. Stopping without reason feels like giving up. So how can any belief be truly justified? Some thinkers bite the bullet. Foundationalists accept basic beliefs that need no further support. Coherentists argue that justification is holistic, beliefs support each other in a web. Infinitists embrace the infinite chain, saying justification is never complete, just always extendable. But none offer a perfect escape. The trilemma reveals that our structure of knowledge may not rest on solid rock, but on a recursive lattice like scaffolding held up by tension, not by ground. It invites humility in our assertions. In science, in ethics, in reasoning itself, we must often accept that our foundations are provisional. They are good enough to build upon, but not absolute. The Munchausen Trilemma doesn't destroy knowledge, it transforms it. From a castle of certainty into a cathedral of open sky. What holds it up is not stone, but movement, the ongoing effort to support thought with better thought. And that effort may be the only justification that truly justifies. Level 39, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles. In Lewis Carroll's famous dialogue, Achilles presents a logical syllogism. If A implies B and A is true, then B must follow. The tortoise agrees with the premises, but not the conclusion. He asks Achilles to add the rule itself as a new premise, but then he demands justification for accepting that new premise, and so on. No matter how many times Achilles adds the rule, the tortoise can always step back and say, "But why should I accept that implication?" This is what the tortoise said to Achilles, and it's a paradox about the application of logic. The tortoise shows that logical inference cannot be enforced merely by stating more premises. At some point, inference must be accepted as a practice, not derived endlessly from more statements. Logic, then, is not just about rules, it's about following rules. The paradox draws a line between knowing a rule and being willing to use it. This distinction is subtle but crucial. It reveals that no system of logic can force someone to reason logically, because the very act of inference is outside the system. The tortoise challenges the idea that logic is self-sufficient. Instead, it must rest on a kind of trust, a willingness to move from premise to conclusion. The dialogue is light, but the consequences are heavy. It suggests that reason depends on something irreducible, a leap, an act, a mental gesture. And in that gesture, we see that logic is not mechanical, it is human. Even Achilles, swift of foot, cannot outrun the tortoise's paradox. Because reasoning is not a race, it's a choice to follow, not just to know. Level 40, Russell's Paradox. Imagine a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves. Does it contain itself? If it does, then by definition it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it must. This is Russell's paradox, one of the most famous and devastating discoveries in logic. It shattered the naive foundation of set theory proposed by Frege, who believed that any coherent property could define a set. Russell showed that unrestricted comprehension, the idea that any describable collection forms a set, leads to contradiction. The paradox appears simple, but its consequences shook the world of mathematics. It meant that formal systems, if too expressive, become unstable. Russell's solution was type theory, creating hierarchies to prevent self-reference. Later, Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory became the standard foundation for mathematics, carefully avoiding the trap by limiting which sets could be members of others. But the paradox remains a warning. It teaches that self-reference, when combined with abstraction, is dangerous. That infinity, logic, and definition must be fenced in. In computer science, philosophy, and linguistics, Russell's ghost appears whenever systems are allowed to refer to themselves, whether in programs calling themselves or language describing its own grammar. The paradox also hints at deeper truths about identity and containment. Can a thing fully contain itself? Can thought fully think itself? Russell's paradox is not just about sets. It's about systems that exceed themselves, mirrors that reflect endlessly, and truths that collapse when too tightly grasped. It is the riddle that guards the gates of consistency, whispering that every rule must know where it ends, or risk becoming its own undoing. Level 41, Cantor's Paradox. Georg Cantor revolutionized mathematics by exploring the idea of infinity not as a singularity, but as a hierarchy, an infinite ladder of infinities. He discovered that the set of all real numbers is more numerous than the set of natural numbers. This insight led him to conceive of an even greater set, the set of all sets. But here lies the trap. If every set has a cardinality, and the collection of all sets must include every cardinality, then this collection must itself be larger than any set, including itself. This is Cantor's paradox. It arises when we try to treat the set of all sets as a genuine set. The result is a contradiction, a totality that is larger than itself. Cantor's work showed that infinity could be structured, compared, and even counted. But his paradox revealed a darker truth. Some infinities are so vast they collapse the structure that holds them. To resolve this, mathematicians redefined the foundations of set theory, most notably with Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which avoids such too large collections by introducing constraints. The paradox highlights that not all collections can be safely made into sets. It reminds us that abstraction has limits. You cannot bottle infinity into a set without the bottle breaking. Cantor's paradox whispers that some wholes are too immense to exist as parts. And in that whisper, mathematics found both a warning and a doorway to modern logic, where infinity is no longer a dream, but a wild creature to be carefully tamed. Level 42, Bhartrhari Paradox. At first glance, ordering things seems simple. You can arrange numbers, sizes, even concepts in a neat line. Mathematicians sought to do the same with ordinals, numbers that describe position in a well-ordered sequence. But when you try to collect all ordinals into a single well-ordered set, a contradiction emerges. This is the Bhartrhari Paradox. It shows that the set of all ordinals would itself have to be an ordinal, larger than all the ordinals it contains, and yet also one of them. That's impossible. The paradox, discovered by Cesar Bhartrhari in 1897, reveals that certain totalities are too vast to exist within standard set theory. It's not just that they're big, they're logically incoherent. The paradox collapses on itself like a stairway built so high it folds into the sky. It demonstrated that even well-defined, carefully built mathematical constructs like ordinals could betray the system when stretched too far. The resolution, as with Cantor's paradox, lies in restricting set formation, using axioms to prevent runaway constructions that eat themselves. But Bhartrhari's warning goes beyond mathematics. It's about the dangers of totalization, of trying to gather all steps into a final step, all moments into a last moment. The paradox tells us there is always a beyond, always something not captured. In logic, as in life, the ladder of thought climbs until it loops. And what lies beyond the last rung is not certainty, but paradox. Level 43, Quinns Paradox. Mathematics, when formalized through first-order logic, is meant to be precise, exact, and unambiguous. But Quinns Paradox reveals a bizarre twist. In set theory, we can prove that there exists an uncountable set, like the real numbers. Yet, paradoxically, we can construct a countable model of set theory where all the sets that exist appear to be countable from within that model. How can a model that believes in uncountable sets itself be countable? This is Quinns Paradox, named after Norwegian logician Thorolf Skolem. The confusion arises from the difference between internal and external perspectives. From the outside, we see that the model is countable. But from inside the model, the entities it describes are experienced as uncountable, even though the whole model can be enumerated. It's not a contradiction, it's a relativity of mathematical meaning. The paradox strikes at the heart of formalism. It shows that meaning in mathematics can shift depending on perspective. That uncountability is not absolute, it's contextual. The implications ripple into philosophy, where it questions the idea of a single, objective mathematical universe. If a model can believe in infinities that don't exist externally, what does that say about truth? Quinns Paradox whispers that even precision has its illusions. That mathematics is not just structure but shadow. That our grasp of the infinite, the uncountable, the vast depends on where we're standing. And perhaps in a deeper sense, all truths live in models, each complete within, but endlessly mirrored without. Level 44, Hilbert's Hotel Paradox. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all occupied. A new guest arrives. And can they be accommodated? Yes. Just move the guest in room 1 to room 2, the guest in 2 to 3, and so on. Room 1 is now free. But what if infinite new guests arrive? No problem. Move the guest in room 1 to room 2, in room 2 to 4, in room 3 to 6, and so on, doubling each room number. Now all the odd-numbered rooms are free for the infinite newcomers. This is Hilbert's Hotel, a paradox conceived by David Hilbert to illustrate the counterintuitive nature of infinite sets. In this strange hotel, no matter how full it is, there is always room for more. Infinity bends intuition. In finite hotels, a full house is the end, but infinite hotels never fill. Hilbert's Hotel is more than a story, it's a metaphor for the mathematics of the infinite. It shows that adding to or rearranging infinite sets can yield results that defy expectation. It even applies in physics and cosmology where questions of infinite space, time, or universes arise. The paradox is playful yet profound. It reveals that infinity is not a number, it's a condition, a way of being. And in that condition, the usual rules fall away. The hotel reminds us that logic has rooms we've never entered, and that in the architecture of thought, the infinite is not just vast, it's weird. And yet, somewhere in its corridors, the impossible checks in and always finds a bed. Level 45, Galileo's Paradox of Infinity. In the realm of the infinite, equality can look like contradiction. Galileo observed that the set of natural numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 is clearly larger than the set of perfect squares 1, 4, 9, 16. Since not every number is a square, the squares must be fewer. But a 1-to-1 mapping is possible. 1 maps to 1 to the power of 2, 2 to 4, 3 to 9, and so on. Every natural number has exactly 1 square, and every square has 1 root. This creates a perfect pairing. Thus, Galileo concluded, the part is equal to the whole. This is Galileo's paradox, and it reveals the strange behavior of infinite sets. In the finite world, a subset is always smaller than the set it comes from. But in the infinite, that rule dissolves. The paradox forced mathematicians to rethink size, to invent cardinalities of infinity, where sets can be the same size if they can be perfectly paired regardless of intuition. Galileo's insight predates Cantor, but it paved the way for modern set theory. It teaches that infinity is not just more, it is different. In the infinite, structure matters more than content. A small-looking subset may have the same size as its parent. Infinity has no boundaries, and in its presence our expectations collapse. Galileo's paradox whispers that logic and reality do not always move in unison, that the universe may contain infinities that stretch and loop and match in impossible ways, and that, when we gaze at the endless, we must leave behind our counting fingers and carry only reason. Level 46, Bhartrhari Paradox. Imagine you have a solid ball, a perfect three-dimensional sphere. Now imagine that you could divide that ball into a handful of pieces, move them around without stretching or changing their shape, and reassemble them into 2 identical copies of the original ball. This is not science fiction. This is the Bhartrhari Paradox. It tells us that using only 5 disjoint sets you can duplicate a sphere, not by duplicating matter, but by rearranging it. The paradox arises from the strange properties of infinite sets and non-measurable subsets under the axiom of choice in set theory. Each piece is not a normal solid chunk, but a bizarre, infinitely complex, dust-like cloud of points so fragmented that they defy traditional volume. The rearrangement isn't physical, but purely mathematical, an abstraction that mocks our intuition. In the physical world, such a thing is impossible due to the continuity of matter and the laws of physics. But in mathematics, where points are unbounded and logic allows the unimaginable, the paradox holds. The Bhartrhari Paradox is deeply unsettling. It tells us that volume, the very notion of how much stuff there is, cannot be preserved in all cases. That under certain rules, duplication arises not through creation, but through redefinition. It invites us to reflect on what space truly is, on whether our universe is countable or continuous, and whether the laws of logic, when stretched to their limits, don't just bend reality, but shatter it into impossible reflections. Level 47, Hilbert-Bernay's Paradox. Suppose you try to define the concept of definability itself, not casually, but formally, within a consistent system. You create a definition. A sentence is definable if it meets certain criteria expressible in your logical language. Then you ask, is the set of all definable sets itself definable? This innocent question unravels into the Hilbert-Bernay's paradox. It mirrors the famous Russell's paradox, but applies not to sets, but to syntactical constructs like formulas and definitions. If the set of all definable sets is definable, it must be part of itself. But if it includes only those sets that are not definable, it becomes undefined. The paradox exposes the fragility of self-reference in formal systems. It shows that when language turns inward, speaking about its own structure, contradictions bloom. Like a mirror facing another mirror, definition reflecting on definition creates a hall of recursive uncertainty. Hilbert and Bernay sought to rigorously formalize mathematics and eliminate such contradictions. But this paradox revealed the unavoidable shadow of self-referential limitation. It became one of many stepping stones toward Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which shattered the dream of complete, self-consistent mathematical systems. The Hilbert Bernays paradox whispers that every system contains its own edge, that some truths, especially about truth itself, cannot be trapped in definition, and that meaning, once it turns inward too far, may dissolve into paradox not through error but through perfect logic. Level 48, Quinns Paradox. In the quest to create a purely logical foundation for mathematics, Alonzo Church and his colleagues developed lambda calculus, a formal system meant to define functions with mathematical precision. But then came the Quinns Paradox, a contradiction that emerged from within the system itself. It revealed that even such a carefully crafted system could express a function that, when applied to itself, leads to a logical inconsistency. This is more than a technical failure. It is a philosophical fracture. The paradox proves that any system expressive enough to define functions about themselves can construct a function that contradicts itself, much like the liar saying, "This statement is false." The contradiction is unavoidable, as long as the system allows unrestricted self-application. It undermined the idea that lambda calculus, and by extension Church's logicism, could form a complete and consistent foundation for all of mathematics. It also led directly to Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Turing's halting problem, which formalized the limits of computation and proof. The Quinns paradox isn't just about functions, it's about the fragility of foundations. It tells us that when we build systems to mirror all possible truths, we must also accept that some truths will shatter the mirror. It's a lesson not just in logic, but in humility, that the mind's attempt to fully contain itself may always fall short, and that in every language rich enough to describe everything, a silence waits that cannot be resolved. Level 49, All Horses Are the Same Color Paradox. At first glance, a clever proof appears to show that in any group of horses, all horses are the same color. It begins with a base case. In a group of one horse, clearly, all horses are the same color. Then it uses mathematical induction, a powerful technique in which a statement is proven for one case, and then for every subsequent case, to prove that if a group of n horses are all the same color, then a group of n one horses must also be. The argument compares overlapping subsets of the group and concludes that color must match across all horses. But here's the catch: the logic breaks at n2. When comparing a group of one horse with another group of one horse, there's no overlap, and so no way to infer color consistency. The mistake is subtle but crucial. The induction step fails to bridge the gap from individual to collective. And so the conclusion that all horses are the same color is absurd. This is the all horses are the same color paradox, and it illustrates how even valid techniques can mislead when misapplied. It's a reminder that rigor must be matched by context, that mathematics is not just formulas but foundations. It shows that logic, when misstepped, doesn't just err, it constructs perfect illusions. And in those illusions, the impossible may briefly seem true until the veil lifts and reveals the flaw, a single missing connection that breaks the spell. Level 50, the Interesting Number Paradox. Every natural number is either interesting or not. Suppose we list all the uninteresting numbers. There must be a smallest uninteresting number. Call it n. But now, isn't that very fact, being the smallest uninteresting number, itself interesting? This is the Interesting Number Paradox, a lighthearted but profound paradox that toys with the nature of classification and language. It shows that the boundary between interesting and uninteresting is self-erasing. As soon as you try to define unremarkableness, you highlight its uniqueness, thus making it remarkable. The paradox is often used to mock the subjectivity of interestingness, but it has deeper implications. It reveals the instability of definitions that depend on context, observer judgment, or metaproperties. What's more, it illustrates how self-reference and classification can clash, that assigning a label to a category can affect its membership. In logic and computer science, similar issues arise with quines, fixed-point theorems, and recursion. But the Interesting Number Paradox doesn't pretend to resolve, it invites you to smile at the absurdity of trying to pin meaning down. It suggests that any attempt to cleanly divide the world into worthy and unworthy may end in circularity. That even the mundane under scrutiny becomes profound. That perhaps every number, every idea is interesting if only we look at it long enough. Level 51, the halting paradox. Can you write a program that takes in another program and its input and tells you whether that program will eventually stop or run forever? Alan Turing proved that such a program is impossible. This is the halting problem, and it shattered the dream of complete automation in computation. The proof is elegant and devastating. Suppose you have a function, halty, that returns true if a program halts and false if it doesn't. Now, create a program that takes an input and calls halt on itself. If halte says the program halts, it goes into an infinite loop. If halt says it loops forever, the program halts. In both cases, contradiction. Thus, halt cannot exist. This is the halting paradox, and it establishes a fundamental limit on what machines and even minds can know. No matter how advanced a system is, there will always be questions it cannot decide. The halting problem gave rise to undecidability theory, shaped modern computation, and underpins Gödel's incompleteness theorems. It whispers that knowledge has boundaries, that even with infinite memory and time, some questions remain unknowable, not from lack of power, but from logical impossibility. The halting paradox reminds us that truth, like a coastline, is infinite in length but bounded in reach, and that within every system, some riddles are destined not for solution, but for reverence. Level 52, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In 1931, a quiet but earth-shaking realization emerged from the brilliant mind of Kurt Gödel. At a time when mathematicians were desperately seeking a complete, consistent, and decidable foundation for all of mathematics, Gödel proved a shocking truth: no such system is possible. His first incompleteness theorem states that in any sufficiently expressive formal system, one capable of arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. And his second incompleteness theorem goes further, showing that such a system cannot prove its own consistency. This is not a failure of logic, but a revelation of its built-in limits. Gödel achieved this using a self-referential statement. A mathematical version of this sentence is unprovable. If it could be proven, the system would be inconsistent. If it couldn't, then the system is incomplete. Either way, the dream of total certainty collapses. The implications ripple far beyond mathematics. Gödel's work tells us that truth transcends proof, that reason has blind spots, and that any system rich enough to describe the world will always contain mysteries it cannot resolve. His theorems became cornerstones of modern logic and computer science, shaping everything from algorithm theory to artificial intelligence. But their philosophical depth is equally staggering. They hint that the universe, even when written in numbers, contains truths that evade capture, realities that resist reduction. Gödel's incompleteness isn't just a paradox, it is a mirror, showing the mind's reach and its edge. It whispers that truth is not a cage but a horizon, always expanding just beyond the furthest proof. Level 53, Thomson's Lamp Paradox. Picture a lamp. You switch it on after 1 minute, then off after another half minute, then on after a quarter minute, then off after an eighth, and so on, doubling the frequency each time. After exactly 2 minutes, you've toggled the lamp infinitely many times. So at the 2-minute mark, is the lamp on or off? This is Thomson's Lamp Paradox, a dazzling thought experiment that reveals the strange behaviors of infinity within finite time. On one hand, every on has a corresponding off, and vice versa. Yet there is no final action, no last switch to determine the final state. The lamp ends up in a kind of limbo, caught between on and off, a binary indecision spawned by infinite processes collapsing into a moment. This paradox isn't just whimsical. It shakes the foundations of how we interpret motion, time, and causality. It illustrates that performing an infinite number of actions in finite time leads to undefined or contradictory results. Mathematicians call this a supertask, and it challenges our assumptions about continuity and limit behavior. Can we meaningfully talk about the outcome of an unending process? Can infinity be completed? The paradox suggests that temporal progression might not be infinitely divisible in reality, or that logic itself bends at such extremes. It's a whisper that in our quest to understand time, we may find edges where reason flickers, like the lamp itself, neither fully on nor off, but paradoxically suspended in the glow of the infinite. Level 54, Ross-Littlewood Paradox. Imagine a jar. At 1 minute to midnight, you place 10 numbered balls into the jar and remove the one labeled 1. At half a minute to midnight, you insert balls labeled 11 through 20 and remove ball 2. You continue this, doubling the frequency, always removing the lowest numbered ball. At midnight, how many balls are in the jar? It seems that with each step, 9 more balls remain, so the jar fills infinitely. Yet every ball is eventually removed. This is the Ross-Littlewood Paradox, and it pushes the limits of how we interpret infinity and limit processes. From one angle, the jar should be full, you're adding infinite balls. From another, it should be completely empty. Every ball, no matter how high its number, gets removed at some finite step. Both views are logically consistent and yet mutually exclusive. The paradox demonstrates how order matters in infinite operations. In the world of the infinite, addition and subtraction do not behave like they do in the finite realm. The outcome of infinite processes can shift depending on arrangement. This challenges not only our intuition, but also the assumptions of analysis and set theory. The Ross-Littlewood Paradox invites reflection on what it means to complete an infinite sequence, and whether such completions are even meaningful. It teaches that infinity is not a number, but a terrain, one with cliffs, valleys, and mirages. In that terrain, logic walks carefully, and even a jar, small and innocent, can become a theater for the impossible. Level 55, Bhartrhari's Paradox. Suppose an infinite number of guards are stationed along a road, each with instructions to stop any traveler before they reach the next guard. You set out on this road. Before you reach the first guard, you must be stopped by the second. But before reaching him, the third must stop you. This continues forever. Yet none of the guards actually stops you, because each assumes someone before them already did. Still, you cannot move forward, for the infinite wall of intention stretches endlessly ahead. This is Bhartrhari's Paradox, and it reveals a metaphysical trap created not by physical barriers, but by the accumulation of future conditions. The paradox doesn't rely on time reversal or supertasks, it rests purely on logical foresight. An infinite set of constraints, none of which activate, collectively prevent movement. It challenges our understanding of causation, agency, and the nature of action across infinite domains. How can an outcome occur or fail to occur based solely on an infinite absence of action? The Bhartrhari Paradox resonates with certain philosophical concerns about potential sieves, actual infinity. It hints at how reasoning with endless futures or infinite regressions can lead to paradoxical paralysis. In theology and metaphysics, similar constructs appear when discussing omniscience, divine foreknowledge, or predestination. It raises questions about determinism and whether the future, in being fully mapped, can constrain the present. Bhartrhari's Paradox reminds us that action can be blocked not by what is but by what must be, and that infinity, when laid across time or logic, can lock doors that were never physically shut. Level 56, Grim Reaper Paradox. Imagine a man resting quietly in his bed, completely unaware that his life is the target of an infinite and perfectly timed plan. At exactly 1 a.m., a Grim Reaper is scheduled to strike, ending his life instantly if no earlier Reaper has already done so. But there's another Reaper scheduled for 12:30 a.m., and another for 12:15, and so on, each Reaper appearing at half the time of the previous one, in a series that never ends. Before the man reaches even the first minute past midnight, he should have already been visited by infinitely many Reapers, each poised to act only if none before them have. Yet none of these Reapers ever get their moment. Because for any Reaper you name, there's always another scheduled earlier. So, who delivers the fatal blow? There is no first cause, no originating act. And yet, paradoxically, the man must still be dead by 1 a.m. This is the Grim Reaper Paradox, a riddle that reveals the terrifying elegance of infinite regress. It challenges our understanding of cause and effect, of how actions are supposed to unfold in time. If there's no first Reaper to act, how can any of them act at all? And if none act, how does the man die? The paradox leads us into a realm where logic seems to devour itself. It proposes that infinite conditions, even if each is well-defined, can create a situation that is both complete and causally hollow. A death with no killer, a conclusion without a beginning. In the world of the Grim Reaper Paradox, the infinite is not just vast. It's unreasonably powerful, yet hauntingly empty. Level 57, Grandis Series Paradox. Picture a sequence that goes like this: 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 on and on forever. At first glance, it seems to teeter endlessly between two outcomes, 1 and 0, 1 and 0, never settling, always flickering. This is Grandis series. If you group the terms as 1 minus 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus ... the sum looks like 0. If you rearrange them as 1 plus, minus 1 plus 1, plus minus 1 plus 1, and so on, the result appears to be 1. And yet, in a different mathematical treatment known as Caesaro summation, the value of this divergent series is assigned as 1/2. This is where the paradox begins. How can the same infinite series have multiple, even contradictory, sums depending on how we handle it? Grandis series paradox shows us that infinity does not behave like finite arithmetic. Operations like associativity and commutativity break down when extended into the infinite. It's not a contradiction of mathematics, but a revelation that different summation methods can yield different interpretations. In physics, particularly quantum field theory, such techniques are used to tame infinities that arise in the math, assigning them useful and predictive values. Grandis series reminds us that infinite processes are not bound by the same rules as finite ones. They must be approached with care, with awareness that meaning depends on method. The paradox teaches us that infinity is less a number and more a concept, shifting, contextual, and deeply strange. And in its strange logic lies a gentle reminder: sometimes ambiguity isn't a flaw. It's a feature. Level 58, Achilles and the Tortoise. The mighty Achilles challenges a tortoise to a foot race. Out of fairness, Achilles gives the tortoise a small head start. When the race begins, Achilles quickly reaches the point where the tortoise started. But by that time, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. Achilles then reaches that new point, only to find the tortoise still slightly ahead. And again. And again. In this way, Achilles is always closing the gap, but never overtaking the tortoise. It seems absurd. Achilles is vastly faster. Surely he will pass the tortoise. And in real life, of course he does. But Zeno's paradox isn't about literal races. It's about the strange consequences of dividing time and space into an infinite number of points. The journey from one place to another, according to the paradox, requires completing an infinite number of tasks, reaching every halfway point, no matter how small. So how can motion even be possible? The resolution lies in the mathematics of infinite series. Though there are infinitely many steps, their durations shrink quickly enough that their total is finite. Achilles can reach the tortoise and pass him. But the deeper point remains. Zeno's paradox reveals that our notions of motion, time, and continuity rest on delicate assumptions. Is time made of indivisible moments? Or does it flow continuously? Are space and distance infinitely divisible, or do they come in atomic units? Achilles and the tortoise may race for sport, but their contest is a question aimed straight at the heart of existence itself. Level 59. Dichotomy Paradox. Before reaching any destination, you must first get halfway there. And before that, halfway to the halfway point. And before that, again halfway. The path divides endlessly into smaller and smaller segments, each one demanding to be crossed. So how can you ever reach your goal if an infinite number of steps must be completed first? This is Zeno's dichotomy paradox. It suggests that motion is impossible because it requires accomplishing an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time. It's a slow unraveling of the very fabric of progress. And yet people do move. Arrows fly. Runners finish races. The solution, as found in modern calculus, is that the sum of these infinitely many small distances can converge to a finite total. Each step takes less time than the last, and the total time is finite. But this mathematical solution doesn't erase the mystery. The paradox forces us to confront the strangeness of infinite division. It blurs the line between the abstract and the real. Is space truly continuous? Or are there smallest possible distances beyond which division is meaningless? In a world governed by quantum physics, such questions take on new weight. The dichotomy paradox invites us to question not only how we move, but whether our picture of space and time is merely a useful illusion. It teaches that progress is possible not in spite of infinity, but because we've learned how to live with it. Level 60. Arrow Paradox. An arrow is flying through the air, but freeze the moment, take a single instant, and in that snapshot, the arrow is still. At any single point in time, it occupies a space equal to its own length. It's not moving forward or backward. It simply is. But if time is made of such moments, then the arrow is always still. So how can it be said to move? This is Zeno's arrow paradox. It challenges the very idea of motion by dissecting time into indivisible instants. In each moment, there is no change. But if all of time is composed of such moments, how does change arise? The modern answer lies in the idea of instantaneous velocity, a concept from calculus that allows us to define motion not by looking at a moment, but by examining how position changes around that moment. Motion exists not in the instant itself, but in the relation between moments. Still, the paradox leaves a philosophical residue. If reality is a series of frozen frames, how is the illusion of continuity constructed? Is time a film reel flickering past our eyes, or a stream that flows without edges? The arrow paradox doesn't deny motion, but it forces us to see that our understanding of it depends entirely on how we define time. In each frozen moment, the arrow doesn't fly. But when strung together, those moments compose a story, one in which the arrow soars. Level 61, Quinns Paradox. Imagine a professor announcing some of the students passed the exam. The statement seems clear, even reassuring. But later you learn that all the students passed. The professor didn't lie, but why didn't they just say all? This subtle discomfort is the heart of Quinns Paradox, which examines the gap between literal meaning and conversational implication. Philosopher Paul Grace proposed that communication is governed by cooperative principles, unwritten rules that speakers and listeners subconsciously follow. When someone says some, we often infer not all because the speaker chose not to say all. That choice carries meaning, even though the literal word doesn't. The paradox arises because language is not just about what is said, but also what is left unsaid. In formal logic, some can include all, but in conversation, the two are distinct. Quinns Paradox illustrates how our intuitions about meaning don't always align with strict logical structure. It reveals how communication is layered, relying on assumptions, context, and shared norms. It's not a contradiction in logic, but a contradiction between logic and expectation. The paradox invites us to question how much of what we hear is shaped by hidden inferences. It shows how language, so precise in theory, can become a minefield of implication in practice. Quinns' insight reshaped linguistics and philosophy of language, reminding us that truth is not always found in what's spoken, but often in what's implied, withheld, or strategically omitted. Level 62, Two-Envelope Paradox. You're given two sealed envelopes. One contains twice as much money as the other. You pick one, say envelope A. Now you wonder, should you switch? If envelope A contains X dollars, then the other must contain either X over $2 or 2 times X dollar. Assuming equal probability, the expected value of switching seems to be 1.25x. That's higher than X, so you should switch. But this reasoning applies no matter which envelope you choose, which means you should always switch envelopes. Yet that leads to absurdity, an infinite loop of switching. This is the two-envelope paradox, and it reveals a deep problem in how we calculate expectations. The paradox hinges on misapplying probability. Once you've picked an envelope and assume its value is X dollars, treating that as a fixed quantity in a variable framework creates a contradiction. The flaw lies in failing to account for how X is defined. If X is the lesser amount, then the expectation works out. But if X is arbitrary, or determined after selection, the logic collapses. The resolution often involves clarifying the distribution used to assign the values in the envelopes. Without a proper prior distribution, the expectation becomes meaningless. The two-envelope paradox is not just about envelopes, it's about the limits of reasoning under uncertainty, the dangers of abstraction, and the pitfalls of conditional expectation. It teaches us to be cautious with probabilities, especially when self-reference and vague priors enter the mix. The allure of more hides a trap. In seeking logic, we can become entangled in our own calculations. Level 63, Sleeping Beauty Paradox. Sleeping Beauty agrees to a strange experiment. On Sunday, she is put to sleep. A fair coin is tossed. If it lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, then sleeps again until the experiment ends on Wednesday. If it lands tails, she is awakened on Monday and again on Tuesday, each time with memory erased of the previous awakening. Upon waking during the experiment, she's asked, "What is your credence that the coin landed heads?" Two camps emerge. One says 1/2 the coin is fair, and nothing changes that. The other says 1/3 because if the coin is tails, she wakes twice, giving 2/3 chance of being in a tails world. This is the Sleeping Beauty Paradox, a famous problem in probability and epistemology. It asks, how should self-locating belief work? The third-order argument counts awakenings. There are 2 for tails, 1 for heads, so she should assign 1/3 to heads. The half-order argument holds that nothing has changed about the fairness of the coin. The paradox reveals how probability shifts when the observer is part of the scenario. It's not just about the coin, it's about you waking without memory, unsure not just of the world's state, but your place in it. Sleeping Beauty teaches that uncertainty is not only about facts, but perspective. It challenges the idea of evidence, identity, and what it means to know something when the ground beneath your awareness is intentionally unstable. It is a dreamlike loop of logic where waking doesn't bring clarity, only deeper doubt. Level 64, Monty Hall Paradox. You're on a game show. Before you are 3 doors, behind one is a car, behind the others, goats. You choose door 1. The host, who knows what's behind each door, opens door 3, revealing a goat. He offers you a chance to switch your choice to door 2. Should you? Intuition says it doesn't matter. 2 doors, 1 prize, 50-50. But logic says otherwise. This is the Monty Hall Paradox, and the correct move is to switch. When you first chose door 1, there was a 1/3 chance the car was there, and a 2/3 chance it wasn't. Monty's action of revealing a goat doesn't split the odds evenly. Instead, it shifts all the unchosen probability to the remaining door. So door 2 now holds a 2/3 chance of having the car. The paradox tricks our instincts. We assume that new choices reset the game, but Monty's knowledge and his intentional action change the information landscape. The Monty Hall Paradox is not just about goats and doors. It's about conditional probability, the power of informed intervention, and how reasoning changes when others act with knowledge we don't have. It teaches that human intuition often fails under uncertainty, and that deeper truths emerge only when we follow logic, not impulse. In the end, switching isn't just statistically correct, it's a lesson in how understanding context transforms the odds. Level 65, Simpson's Paradox. 2 treatments are tested for effectiveness. In men, treatment O outperforms B. In women, treatment A again outperforms B. But when the data is combined, suddenly treatment B appears better overall. This is Simpson's Paradox, a striking anomaly where a trend in subgroups reverses when those groups are aggregated. It seems impossible, but it's real. The reason lies in confounding variables, hidden factors that influence the outcome. Perhaps more women received treatment A, and women had lower recovery rates overall. The group sizes and background characteristics distort the totals, flipping the result. This paradox isn't a mathematical error. It's a cautionary tale. It shows that data must be interpreted in context, and that averages can mislead. In medicine, it can affect which drugs are chosen. In social science, it can reverse conclusions about bias or performance. Simpson's paradox warns that correlations can disappear, reappear, or reverse entirely, depending on how data is sliced. It teaches that truth is fragile when broken into parts. In a world increasingly run by statistics, Simpson's paradox reminds us that numbers alone aren't enough. Interpretation, causality, and structure matter. The paradox calls for humility, a recognition that knowledge built on data must be paired with understanding of the system generating it. Otherwise, what seems clear might be the most elegant of illusions. Level 66 Intransitive Dice Paradox. Imagine 3 custom dice, each with non-standard numbers on their faces. DA might beat DB most of the time. Die B in turn beats DC. But in a twist of logic, die C can then beat die A. This circular, non-linear dominance defies traditional expectations of transitivity, where if A beats B and B beats C, A should beat C. But in this paradox, intransitivity reigns. It's as if in a rock-paper-scissors loop, each choice defeats another, but none is supreme. Known as the intransitive dice paradox, this phenomenon arises from careful design of probabilities rather than pure randomness. Each die has faces arranged so that over many rolls the statistical outcome favors a specific rival. This paradox reveals a hidden depth in probability. Dominance is not always absolute or hierarchical. In games, voting systems, and even competitive strategies, similar loops can emerge, where preferences or strengths form cycles rather than clear winners. The dice teach us that fairness and predictability are not guaranteed even when rules are consistent. The paradox invites us to question how we define superiority. It challenges assumptions about order and shows that in a probabilistic world, logic can be cyclical, not linear. Intransitive dice whisper that the world is not built on clean hierarchies, but rather strange loops where every winner can become a loser in the right matchup. Level 67, Necktie Paradox. 2 people are gifted neckties. Each is told the other's tie is more expensive. Curious, they agree to wager whoever has the cheaper tie must give it to the other. But now a problem emerges. Each thinks I have a 50% of having the cheaper tie. If I do, I lose my tie. But if I have the more expensive one, I win the cheaper one, less valuable. So my expected loss seems higher than the expected gain. Thus, both conclude they will lose by participating. But how can that be? This is the Necktie Paradox, where symmetrical logic produces asymmetric anxiety. The flaw lies in the mistaken idea that one will gain less than they could lose. But because both parties reason identically, the expectations should cancel out. The paradox demonstrates a failure in conditional expectation, misjudging value due to ambiguity about which item is truly more valuable. It's a problem of framing. When you don't know your own tie's value, every potential loss seems larger than any potential gain. In truth, there's no net advantage or disadvantage. The paradox reveals how our minds instinctively exaggerate risk when dealing with uncertain outcomes. It serves as a mirror into decision-making under foggy conditions where relative comparisons distort absolute value. The Necktie Paradox reminds us that in matters of uncertainty, fear often overshadows reason, and symmetry can look unfair when viewed from only one side. Level 68, Quinns Paradox. Imagine you're bidding in an auction using a strategy designed to maximize long-term return. You base your bids on expected values following all rational rules. But oddly, when you make small, strategic adjustments to improve your performance, say slightly increasing your bid to win more often, you find your long-term gain decreases. This counterintuitive result is known as Quinns Paradox. It arises in economic and game-theoretic models where optimization strategies are pushed too far. By adjusting bids to win more frequently, you end up overpaying. The paradox exposes how rational micro-adjustments can lead to irrational macro outcomes. It's like walking slightly faster on every step, only to find yourself further behind at the end. The heart of the paradox lies in feedback loops, how small changes affect the system's equilibrium. If everyone adjusts their bids based on the same logic, prices inflate, and what once was optimal becomes costly. This paradox reflects a broader truth in economics and life. Optimizing local outcomes doesn't guarantee global improvement. Sometimes restraint is more rational than marginal advantage. Probsting's paradox reveals how systems can punish overconfidence, even when decisions are individually sound. It reminds us that strategy is not just about individual moves, but how those moves ripple through complex environments. In trying to win more, we may unwittingly lose bigger. Level 69, Boy or Girl Paradox. You meet a parent with two children. One of them is a boy. What are the odds that both children are boys? Intuition says 50-50, but that's wrong. The correct answer is 1 in 3. Why? Let's break it down. The possible gender combinations for two children are boy, 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 girl, girl, boy, and girl, girl. Since we know at least one is a boy, we eliminate girl, girl. 3 possibilities remain. Only one of those is boy, boy. Hence the 1/3 result. But if the parent had said, my eldest is a boy, the odds become 1 in 2 because now the identity order matters. This is the boy or girl paradox, and it hinges on conditional probability. It shows how subtle shifts in information, whether about identity order or observation, can dramatically affect outcomes. The paradox also highlights how human intuition fails when parsing seemingly simple probabilities. The confusion arises because at least one is a boy is not the same as specifying which child is a boy. The paradox teaches a key lesson: context is crucial. Who knows what, and how they know it, reshapes the entire problem. The boy or girl paradox is not about children, it's about perception, probability, and how clarity in language affects clarity in thought. It's a window into how assumptions and framing create illusions of understanding. Level 70. St. Petersburg Paradox. You're offered a game. A fair coin is tossed until it lands heads. The payout is $2 for heads on the first toss, $4 on the second, $8 on the third, and so on, doubling each time. What's the expected value of this game? Surprisingly, it's infinite. Yet most people wouldn't pay more than $10 to play. This contradiction between mathematical expectation and real-world behavior is the St. Petersburg Paradox. It challenges the idea that expected value alone determines rational choice. The game's payout function is extreme. Most of the expected value lies in rare, high payout events. But in practice, these events are so unlikely that people dismiss them. The paradox forced economists to reconsider how humans value risk and reward. Daniel Bernoulli resolved it by introducing utility theory, suggesting that the subjective value of money decreases as you have more of it. Doubling $100 is more thrilling than doubling $1,000. So while the expected dollar value is infinite, the expected utility is not. The St. Petersburg Paradox laid the groundwork for modern economics, psychology, and decision theory. It showed that rationality is not just about numbers, it's about how we feel about numbers. The paradox reveals that even infinite reward is not enough to tempt a cautious soul when uncertainty looms large. In the end, it whispers a truth few equations can express. Humans are not calculators, they are cautious dreamers. Level 71, Two Generals Paradox. Imagine two generals on opposite sides of a valley. They must coordinate a surprise attack, but can only communicate by messenger. Each message must cross dangerous ground where it might be lost. General ascends, attack at dawn. General B replies, message received. Agreed. But now A isn't sure if B's message got through. To confirm, A sends another message, did you get my confirmation? And so on. The paradox is this: no matter how many confirmations are exchanged, certainty is never achieved. The Two Generals Paradox shows that in systems with unreliable communication, absolute coordination is impossible. Even if both sides want to act together, the inability to confirm that the confirmation was confirmed prevents absolute trust. This problem is foundational in distributed computing and network protocols. It proves that if messages can fail, consensus cannot be perfectly guaranteed. What seems like a minor issue, just send another message, spirals into an infinite regress. The paradox teaches us that some systems are inherently uncertain, and no clever workaround can erase that instability. It echoes through human relationships, diplomacy, and technology alike. Sometimes trust must be assumed, not confirmed. The Two Generals Paradox is a quiet reminder. Uncertainty isn't always about doubt, it's about the limits of assurance. Level 72, Condorcet's Voting Paradox. In a small election, 3 candidates, A, B, and C, are running. Voters rank them by preference. One group prefers A over B over C. Another prefers B over C over A. A third group prefers C over A over B. Each candidate beats another in pairwise comparisons. A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. It's a loop. This is Condorcet's voting paradox, and it reveals that majority preferences can be cyclic, despite each voter holding rational, linear preferences. The paradox undermines the idea that collective decisions naturally reflect individual rationality. Even when every voter makes sense on their own, the group's overall choice can defy logic. This paradox haunts political theory and voting system design. It proves that no method can always guarantee a fair outcome that respects majority preferences. Sometimes the majority prefers A to B, B to C, and yet still prefers C to A. The cycle traps the decision in an endless loop. It's not a bug, it's a feature of aggregation. Condorcet's insight reveals the fragility of collective will. Democracy is not broken, but it is weird. The paradox whispers that fairness in group choice is not always clean or stable. It's a dance of shifting majorities and complex coalitions, where even logic can get dizzy. Level 73, Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. In the search for a perfect voting system, economist Kenneth Arrow laid down some reasonable rules. The system should respect individual preferences, not be dictated by one person, and be consistent. Simple, right? But Arrow proved a devastating result. No voting system can satisfy all these fairness criteria at once, unless it becomes a dictatorship. This is Arrow's impossibility theorem, one of the most profound discoveries in social choice theory. It's not a paradox in the traditional sense, but a formal proof that perfection in group decision-making is mathematically impossible. Whenever we try to represent individual preferences in a collective way, we must sacrifice something: consistency, fairness, or autonomy. Arrow's theorem shattered hopes of finding an ideal democratic process. Every method, whether ranked voting, approval voting, or majority rule, has flaws. The paradox lies in its inevitability. Even with the best intentions, group decisions will always carry hidden contradictions. The theorem reshaped economics, politics, and philosophy. It taught us to seek not perfect systems, but transparent ones. In trying to give everyone a voice, the system itself can become tangled. Arrow reminds us that fairness is not a finish line, it's a balance of compromise. Level 74, Baratis Paradox. A city adds a new road to ease traffic, but shockingly, overall congestion gets worse. This is Baratis Paradox, where increasing capacity leads to worse performance. Drivers acting selfishly shift routes to optimize their own travel time. But when everyone does this, the system reaches a new equilibrium, one that's slower for all. This counterintuitive result reveals how individual optimization can harm collective outcomes. The paradox is rooted in game theory and network flow. It shows up in transportation, internet traffic, and even biological systems. The new road creates more options, but also new decision loops that degrade efficiency. Sometimes removing roads improves traffic, a phenomenon tested in real cities like Seoul and Stuttgart. Baratis Paradox teaches that more is not always better. It warns that system design must consider behavior, not just capacity. When individuals make decisions independently, the result can be collectively irrational. The paradox is a mirror to modern life. In optimizing for ourselves, we may sabotage each other. It reminds us that systems thrive not on freedom alone, but on thoughtful constraint. Level 75, Friendship Paradox. Think about your friends. On average, they probably have more friends than you do. That's the friendship paradox, a statistical truth that feels like a social illusion. It occurs because people with many friends are more likely to be your friend. Imagine a highly connected person. They show up in many people's friend lists. Meanwhile, someone with few friends appears in only a few. When you average across your social circle, the high connectivity people skew the numbers upward. So most people's friends are more popular than they are. The paradox plays out in social media, academic networks, and even disease transmission. In epidemiology, it means your friends are more likely to get infected, and thus you're at higher risk than personal stats suggest. The friendship paradox reveals how observation is biased by connectivity. It's not just about friends, it's about perspective. What you see is not the average reality, but a reality tilted by visibility and influence. The paradox teaches humility and awareness, that your view of the world may be shaped by those who are most seen, not most representative. In networks, popularity distorts perception. In life, that distortion quietly changes how we feel about ourselves. Level 76. Epimenides Paradox. A family sits in the Texas heat trying to stay cool. One person says, "Let's drive to Abilene for dinner." Another agrees, not wanting to be the only dissenter. One by one, they all nod, even though none truly wants to go. They pack up, endure the long drive in the sweltering car, and eat mediocre food. On the way home, they realize the truth: no one actually wanted to go to Abilene. They went simply because they believed everyone else wanted to. This is the Epimenides Paradox, a haunting example of group miscommunication and misaligned assumptions. Unlike other paradoxes driven by abstract logic or mathematical probability, this one is rooted in human psychology. It illustrates how people may act against their own interests, because they think they're conforming to the group's wishes, when in fact, the group feels the same silent resistance. The paradox thrives on a fear of dissent, the desire to avoid conflict, and the assumption that silence equals consent. It appears in organizations, families, governments, anywhere people suppress their true preferences to maintain harmony. But ironically, this suppression leads to shared decisions no one supports. The Epimenides Paradox is a call for authentic communication. It reminds us that consensus can be an illusion built on politeness, misinterpretation, and fear. Sometimes courage lies in asking, "Do we really want this?" and being brave enough to hear that no one does. Level 77. Buridan's Ass. Imagine a donkey placed exactly between two identical piles of hay. Both are equally distant, equally nourishing, and equally appealing. The donkey, being perfectly rational, tries to choose the better option, but since both are equal, it finds no reason to favor one over the other. Frozen in indecision, it starves. This grim scenario is known as Buridan's Ass, a philosophical paradox named after Jean Buridan. It questions the idea of deterministic rationality. If a creature can only act based on reason, and no reason exists to choose one over the other, then it may never act at all. The paradox probes a deeper question: can pure logic be a trap? Does perfect reason sometimes require irrational action, a leap of spontaneity, emotion, or randomness to break symmetry? Buridan's Ass applies not only to animals or philosophers, but to artificial intelligence, game theory, and human psychology. We too face moments of paralyzing indecision when choices feel equivalent between jobs, partners, or life paths. Sometimes we wait for clarity that never comes. The paradox reminds us that choice is not always about maximizing value, but sometimes breaking the tie. Life doesn't reward perfect balance, it rewards momentum. Buridan's Ass perishes not from hunger, but from the burden of perfection. The solution is simple, and yet profound. Sometimes you just have to pick. Level 78. Prisoner's Dilemma. Two prisoners are accused of a crime. They are held in separate cells and cannot communicate. Each is offered a deal. If you betray your partner and they stay silent, you go free, and they get a long sentence. If you both betray, you both get a moderate sentence. If both stay silent, you get a light sentence. Logically, betrayal seems the safer move, no matter what the other does. But if both betray, they end up worse off than if they had cooperated. This is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important paradoxes in game theory. It captures the tension between individual rationality and collective benefit. The dilemma occurs in war, business, politics, even relationships, anywhere where mutual trust could lead to better outcomes, but self-interest tempts betrayal. The paradox teaches that acting in one's own best interest can lead to worse results for everyone. It's not just a hypothetical. Studies and real-world analogies show people often choose betrayal, even when cooperation would help both. The dilemma reveals that trust is fragile, and the fear of being taken advantage of often outweighs the hope of mutual gain. Strategies like tit for tat in repeated games show that cooperation can emerge over time, but the first move is always the hardest. The prisoner's dilemma whispers a difficult truth. What's best for me might not be best for us. And until we learn to trust, we remain prisoners of our own logic. Level 79, Quinns Paradox. A mysterious being, call it Omega, presents you with two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque. Its contents depend on a prediction Omega made about you yesterday. If Omega predicted you'd take only Box B, it placed $1 million inside. If it predicted you'd take both boxes, Box B is empty. Omega is always right. Now, you stand before the boxes. Do you take just Box B, hoping Omega foresaw your restraint and rewarded you? Or do you take both, reasoning that since Omega has already filled the boxes, your action can't change anything now? This is Quinns Paradox, a riddle that pits causality against prediction and expected value against free will. On one hand, taking both seems rational. What's in the box is already decided. But Omega's perfect predictive power makes the paradox bite. If you two box, Omega likely predicted that and left Box B empty. So the best outcomes consistently go to one boxers. But how can a past prediction change a present choice? Or does the present choice reveal something about your nature that Omega accurately anticipated? Philosophers divide into one boxers and two boxers, each defending logic that seems airtight, yet mutually exclusive. Quinns Paradox challenges the very idea of free will, causality, and rational choice. If your decision is predictable, is it truly free? If reward follows prediction, does prediction shape reality? The paradox invites us to consider that choice may be more than logic. It may be a mirror held up to ourselves, reflecting not what we do, but who we are. Level 80, Memory Identity Paradox. What if your memories weren't yours? What if the foundation of who you are, your personality, your beliefs, your entire life story, was built on memories that are false, borrowed, or incomplete? The Memory Identity Paradox raises a deeply personal question. If memory defines identity and memory can fail, what does that say about who we really are? The philosopher John Locke believed memory was the glue that holds personal identity together. If you remember being a child, he said, then that child was you. But what happens when memory fades or lies? Imagine waking up with someone else's memories implanted in your mind. Would you become that person? What if a perfect copy of your memories was placed into another body? Who would be you then? This paradox emerges not only in thought experiments but in real-life situations. Dementia, amnesia, and false memories all show us how fragile and unreliable our mental records can be. A person with severe memory loss might retain their body, their voice, their habits, but if they cannot recall the past, are they the same person? Or have they quietly become someone new? The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we realize how memories can be edited. Trauma, time, suggestion, or even technology can reshape what we believe happened. In that sense, identity becomes more like a narrative than a fixed truth, a story we tell ourselves, and one that can be rewritten. If that story changes, does our identity shift with it? If we forget something painful, does it stop shaping us? If we remember something falsely, but it influences how we act, is it still a part of who we are? The Memory Identity Paradox doesn't offer easy answers. It simply shines a soft, unsettling light on the idea that selfhood might not be a stable thing. Instead, it may be a thread of awareness stitched through memory, a thread that can twist, tangle, or snap. And if we tug on it too hard, we might find that the person we thought we were is just a shadow of someone half remembered. Level 81, Twin Earth Paradox. Imagine a distant planet just like Earth in every way. Same oceans, same mountains, same people. Everything is a perfect copy, down to the last molecule. But there's one difference. What they call water isn't H2O. It's a chemically different substance called X. It looks, tastes, and behaves like water, but it's not the same compound. This is Twin Earth, a thought experiment by philosopher Hilary Putnam. The paradox arises when we ask, when you say the word water, what do you mean? Is meaning based on internal thoughts or external reality? Suppose your twin Earth twin says water. Their internal state mirrors yours exactly, but they refer to X's, not H2O. So, the meaning of water must depend not just on what's in your head, but what's in your world. That's the paradox. Meaning isn't only mental, it's contextual. It breaks the illusion that words are defined purely by what we think. Instead, they're partly anchored in the world outside us and the substances and structures we interact with. Twin Earth forces us to rethink what it means to mean something, challenging the boundaries between thought and reference. It whispers that identity, even of language, is not always found within, but without. Level 82, Ship of Theseus. Suppose a great ship, the ship of Theseus, is preserved in a museum. Over time, its wooden planks begin to rot, and one by one, each piece is replaced with an identical new one. After years, none of the original materials remain. Is it still the same ship? Now imagine all the original planks are stored and eventually reassembled into a second ship, which is the real ship of Theseus. This ancient paradox questions the persistence of identity through change. Is identity in form, function, continuity, or in original matter? If identity persists through gradual change, then the restored ship is a copy. But if identity is tied to material continuity, then the ship in the museum is no longer authentic. Philosophers use this paradox to explore not just objects, but people. You've replaced almost every cell in your body over the years. Are you still the same you? What if your memories were copied, your thoughts replicated in a machine? Would that be you or a duplicate? The ship of Theseus quietly unmoors our assumptions. It shows us that identity is not as stable or obvious as it appears. It's a paradox that leaves us drifting between parts and wholes, originals and successors, in search of something constant and finding only questions. Level 83, Swampman Thought Experiment. Donald Davidson imagined this eerie scenario. Lightning strikes a swamp and, purely by chance, assembles a perfect physical replica of you from the muck. This swampman has all your memories, habits, and personality. It walks out of the swamp and goes about your life, greeting your friends, solving your problems, and continuing your work. But here's the twist: Swampman has no causal history. Its memories were never formed by actual experiences. So is it really you? The paradox challenges the notion that identity lies in the present structure of mind. If Swampman is physically identical and behaves identically, does it matter that it wasn't born, didn't learn, didn't live your past? Davidson says yes, it matters, because meaning and mind depend on history. Swampman may seem like you, but it never lived. Others argue that identity is in the pattern, not the path. If it walks like you, talks like you, and feels like you, perhaps it is you. The Swampman Paradox raises haunting questions about what it means to be conscious, to be real. Is experience something that can be copied, or must it be lived? It suggests that personhood might be less about what you are, and more about how you got there. Level 84, Brain in a Vat. But suppose you're not sitting in a chair right now. Suppose you're just a brain floating in a vat, connected to a supercomputer feeding you perfect sensory data. You believe you're reading these words on a screen, but really it's all simulated input. This is the brain in a vat scenario, a modern echo of Descartes' evil demon. The paradox is about skepticism and knowledge. If this scenario were true, you'd never know. Every test, every observation would itself be part of the illusion. So how can you be sure of anything? Are you living in reality or a dream of reality? The paradox doesn't just question your environment. It challenges the very foundation of belief. If perception can be faked, then knowledge built on perception is forever uncertain. Philosophers wrestle with this by appealing to coherence, pragmatism, or faith, but no answer escapes the shadow completely. The brain in a vat paradox doesn't prove that reality is fake. It just proves that you could never tell if it were. And that uncertainty, that yawning gap between mind and world, is what makes it truly unsettling. Level 85, Boltzmann Brain Paradox. In the vast, eternal universe, particles constantly swirl in random configurations. Given enough time, they'll accidentally assemble into anything, even a fully formed human brain, complete with memories. This is the Boltzmann brain scenario. A disembodied mind, spontaneously generated by chaos, floating briefly in nothingness, yet believing it lived a full life. It's named after physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who proposed that the universe might arise from rare fluctuations in entropy. The paradox asks, if such brains are more likely to exist than full, ordered universes, then statistically, it's more probable you are one of them. Your memories, your past, your world, they're all illusions, blinking into false existence for an instant. This flips logic upside down. The more we rely on probability, the more we're led to doubt everything we take for granted. The paradox undermines the trustworthiness of reason itself. If brains can flicker into existence without cause, then thought, identity, and memory may be illusions sustained only by chance. The Boltzmann brain is not a puzzle to solve. It's a mirror held up to rationality, reflecting its own absurdity. It leaves us in silence, blinking into a cosmos that may have never been. Level 86, Simulation Argument Paradox. Are you real, or are you a line of code? The simulation argument, made famous by philosopher Nick Bostrom, suggests that if it's possible to simulate conscious beings, and advanced civilizations are likely to do so, then it's overwhelmingly probable that we are already living in such a simulation. The paradox begins with a trio of propositions: either civilizations go extinct before developing simulation technology, or they develop it but choose not to simulate conscious beings, or they do simulate, and we are likely among the simulated. If even one advanced society runs ancestor simulations, then the number of simulated minds would vastly outnumber the real ones. So, statistically, it's more likely that you are one of them. The paradox isn't just that we might be simulated, it's that we have no reliable way to disprove it. All the physical laws, memories, and sensations you experience could be part of a highly detailed digital illusion. The simulation argument blurs the lines between metaphysics and mathematics, between sci-fi and philosophy. It asks not only whether our world is real, but whether real even matters if the simulation feels indistinguishable from reality. It shakes the foundation of certainty and quietly suggests that our greatest thinkers might someday exist not in flesh, but in servers. Level 87, Teletransportation Paradox. You step into a machine. It scans your body, atom by atom, disassembles it, transmits the information, and reconstructs you perfectly on Mars. To everyone else, you've traveled light years in an instant. But did you travel, or did you die and get replaced by a copy? This is the Teletransportation Paradox, a chilling thought experiment about identity. If the Martian you remembers everything you did, feels what you felt, and loves who you loved, are they really you? Or are they a replica that thinks it's you? Suppose the original isn't destroyed. Now there are two of you. Which is the real one? If both claim your memories and personality, then identity must be more than information. It must include continuity. But what kind of continuity? Biological, psychological. The paradox becomes more disturbing the closer technology gets to making such transport or mind uploading possible. Would you step into the booth, knowing you might not step out? Or does survival require that some part of you, not just your structure, but your subjective self, makes the leap? The Teletransportation Paradox reveals that identity isn't just about replication. It's about the fragile thread of conscious presence and how easily that thread can be severed even when no one notices. Level 88, Personal Identity Puzzle. What makes you you? Is it your memories, your body, your personality? The personal identity puzzle asks what, if anything, persists as the same across time and change. Suppose you gradually lose all your memories, change your beliefs, switch bodies, or even upload your consciousness into a machine. At what point do you cease to be you? The puzzle intensifies when different components of selfhood conflict. A person with dementia may still look and speak the same, but they no longer remember their spouse, their past, or themselves. Are they still the same person? Philosophers propose various criteria: psychological continuity, physical continuity, or narrative identity, but each has cracks. If your memories were copied into someone else, would that person now be you? If your body lived on without your mind, would you still exist? The personal identity puzzle remains unresolved because the self may not be a single thing, but a constellation of traits loosely bound by time and experience. It suggests that identity is not fixed, but fluid, evolving, decaying, transforming, and perhaps never fully graspable. In the quiet shadows of this puzzle, we begin to question if the I we cling to is just a story we're telling ourselves, moment by moment. Level 89, Paradox of Free Will and Determinism. Do you truly have a choice? Or are you just following a script written by physics? The paradox of free will and determinism explores this unsettling conflict. If the universe is deterministic, if every event is the result of prior causes, then your thoughts, decisions, and actions were predetermined from the start. How then can you be held responsible? On the other hand, if your actions are random, emerging without cause, that doesn't sound like freedom either. The paradox leaves us suspended between two extremes: determinism without choice and randomness without control. Free will, as we usually understand it, seems to vanish in both directions. Some philosophers suggest compatibilism, a view that we can still be free if we act according to our desires, even if those desires are determined. Others reject this as an illusion. Neuroscience adds to the storm. Studies show our brains decide to act milliseconds before we become aware of choosing. Now, does that mean consciousness is just a spectator? The paradox doesn't just ask whether we're free, it asks whether freedom matters. If we're not truly free, how should we live? If we are, where does that freedom begin? The answer remains elusive, but the question shakes the foundations of ethics, law, and human dignity. Level 90, Quantum Suicide Paradox. You sit in a room with a quantum gun. Each time the trigger is pulled, a quantum event determines whether it fires. According to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every possible outcome actually happens, in separate, branching universes. In some, the gun clicks harmlessly. In others, it fires. Now imagine repeating the experiment countless times. In every universe where you die, your consciousness ends. But in every universe where you live, you continue to experience survival. Therefore, from your perspective, you never die, you always find yourself in the branch where you survive. This is the Quantum Suicide Paradox, a chilling twist on quantum theory. It suggests subjective immortality, that no matter how dangerous the scenario, you always wake up alive in some universe. But this comes at a cost. In most branches, you are dead. The paradox isn't just about physics, it touches identity, ethics, and meaning. If quantum immortality is real, does it make life trivial? Or does it raise the stakes, knowing your choices echo across infinite worlds? The Quantum Suicide Paradox whispers a strange comfort and a terrible horror, that you may always live, but only by leaving behind infinite versions of yourself who don't. Level 91, Schrödinger's Cat Paradox. A cat sits in a sealed box, utterly unaware of its fate. Inside the box, there's a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, a vial of poison, and a hammer. If the atom decays, the hammer breaks the vial, killing the cat. If it doesn't, the cat lives. According to quantum mechanics, until the box is opened and observed, the atom is in a superposition, both decayed and not decayed. That means the cat, too, is simultaneously dead and alive. This is the infamous Schrödinger's cat paradox, proposed not to describe reality, but to highlight how absurd quantum superposition seems when scaled up to the macroscopic world. The paradox asks, when does the wave function collapse? When does the cat become one or the other, alive or dead? Is it the act of conscious observation that snaps the universe into certainty? Or is the cat's own awareness part of the equation? The thought experiment reveals a deep tension between quantum theory and classical intuition. It makes us wonder if reality is solid and objective, or if it waits in limbo, unfinished, until we dare to look. In that moment, the mystery of life and death is no longer just philosophical, it becomes entangled in physics itself. Level 92, Winger's Friend Paradox. Take the Schrödinger's cat experiment one step further. Now imagine a scientist, Wigner's friend, observing the cat inside the lab. To the friend, once they look in the box, the cat is either alive or dead. But to Wigner, outside the lab, he unaware of the outcome, his friend is still entangled in a quantum superposition. The lab contains a friend who has seen a dead cat and a friend who has seen a live one. This is the Wigner's friend paradox, and it's even more unsettling than Schrödinger's original idea. It suggests that two observers can have conflicting realities, both valid from their own perspectives. Is reality relative to each observer's information? Does observation create separate universes of truth? The paradox challenges the objectivity of facts, hinting that the universe may not hold a single, coherent state until each perspective is reconciled. In the quantum world, truth becomes slippery, possibly fragmented. And if even two scientists can't agree on the outcome of a simple experiment, what hope is there for consensus in a world built from probabilities? Level 93, Delayed Choice Quantum Eraser. You fire a particle at a screen where it can go through one of two slits. If unobserved, it creates an interference pattern, waves overlapping, as if the particle traveled both paths. If you measure which slit it goes through, the wave collapses. You get two simple bands, just particles, no waves. But now add a twist. After the particle hits the screen, you retroactively erase or preserve the which path data. The delayed choice quantum eraser shows that the interference pattern depends on a future choice. It seems as though the particle somehow knows what you'll do and adjusts its past behavior accordingly. This isn't just confusing, it's time-bending. The paradox suggests that actions in the present can affect what happened in the past, but not in a classical way, only in terms of information. Still, it raises a question that should be impossible. Does the future influence the past? The delayed choice experiment doesn't break causality, it just twists it into something stranger than fiction. It tells us that in quantum mechanics, measurement isn't just observation, it's participation. We don't just record reality. In some haunting sense, we may help shape it. Level 94, Quantum NoNo Paradox. You've heard that a watched pot never boils. In quantum mechanics, that might actually be true. The Quantum NoNo Paradox reveals that by observing a quantum system continuously, you can freeze its evolution. A particle that would normally decay stays suspended simply because you're watching it. The name comes from Zeno's ancient paradoxes, where motion appears impossible. In the quantum version, change halts under persistent scrutiny. How is this possible? Measurement in quantum mechanics collapses the wave function. If you keep measuring before it can evolve into a new state, you repeatedly reset it. The system becomes trapped in limbo, unable to evolve. The paradox challenges the line between observation and control. It suggests that watching isn't passive, it's invasive. In this strange world, reality isn't something that unfolds independently. Instead, your attention freezes it in place. It's a subtle, profound statement about consciousness and time. Perhaps the act of looking doesn't just change what we see, but changes what is. Level 95, Everett's Many Worlds Paradox. Everett proposed a radical answer to quantum mysteries. Every possible outcome of a quantum event actually happens, but in separate, parallel universes. When you flip a coin, in one world it lands heads, in another, tails. The observer, too, splits. One version sees heads, the other sees tails. This is the many worlds interpretation, and it eliminates wave function collapse entirely. Instead of randomness, there's only branching. The paradox is this: if every possibility occurs, what does that mean for identity, probability, and choice? Do infinite versions of you exist, living out every outcome of every decision you've ever faced? In this view, death, failure, and triumph are all experienced, just not by the same you. It's both comforting and terrifying. You never truly die, but you also never avoid any path. The paradox questions whether you are unique or just one among infinite echoes. Everett's idea redefines quantum mechanics not as a story of uncertainty, but of endless certainty, endlessly diverging. The many worlds paradox leaves us wondering, if all paths are walked, then what does it mean to choose? Level 96, Black Hole Information Paradox. Imagine tossing a book into a black hole. The book contains words, knowledge, information. As it crosses the event horizon, it's swallowed, never to be seen again. or so we thought. According to general relativity, nothing escapes a black hole, not even light. But quantum mechanics insists that information can't be destroyed. These two truths, both foundational, collide in the black hole information paradox. If black holes evaporate over time through Hawking radiation, and the radiation is purely thermal, then all the information is lost forever. But that breaks the laws of quantum physics, which demand that processes be reversible. If the information is gone, then the universe becomes unpredictable. Entropy soars. Cause and effect unravel. This paradox has stirred decades of debate. Some say the information is preserved on the event horizon in a kind of cosmic hologram. Others suggest it leaks out slowly in subtle patterns within the radiation itself. Some theories propose wormholes or hidden dimensions. Yet none provide a definitive answer. The paradox turns black holes from cosmic vacuums into puzzles of existence. It reminds us that when gravity and quantum mechanics meet, our current understanding fails. At the center of the paradox lies a question we still can't answer. When reality rips at the seams, what truths, if any, remain? Level 97, Time Travel Grandfather Paradox. You build a time machine. You travel back decades. And while you're there, you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. He never marries. Your parent is never born. And neither are you. But if you were never born, how did you travel back to prevent your own existence? This is the Grandfather Paradox, the most iconic time travel riddle. It confronts causality head-on. If actions in the past can alter the future, then contradictions emerge. Philosophers and physicists alike have proposed solutions. Some say time travel is simply impossible. Others suggest that time is self-healing, that events will adjust to prevent paradoxes. You might try to stop your grandfather but fail no matter what you do. Another idea invokes multiple timelines. Your intervention creates a new branch of reality. In that universe, you were never born, but your original self still exists in a parallel stream. The Grandfather Paradox isn't just about time, it's about identity, logic, and destiny. It questions whether the past is fixed, the future determined, and the present truly free. And behind its looping logic lies a deeper unease. If time can fold, then so can truth. Level 98, Bootstrap Paradox. A scientist travels to the future and finds a blueprint for a time machine. They return to the past and build it, based on the blueprint. That same machine is then discovered in the future and becomes the source of the original blueprint. So, where did the information come from? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, where objects, information, or even people are trapped in causal loops. They exist but have no origin. A song passed from time traveler to composer who writes it and becomes famous. A book brought to the past and published, only to inspire the time traveler to bring it back. In each case, the item is its own source. This paradox breaks our notion of cause and effect. Everything has a beginning, we believe, a root, a reason. But the Bootstrap Paradox erases that foundation. It's like a snake eating its tail, endlessly looping. Quantum theories block universe models, and multiverse explanations all attempt to dodge the paradox, but none dissolve its eerie implications. It leaves us with a reality where the chicken and the egg not only coexist, but might be the same thing, forever caught in a loop with no beginning. Level 99, Predestination Paradox. In some time travel tales, no matter how hard you try, you can't change the future, because your actions are part of it. This is the Predestination Paradox, where attempts to alter destiny only fulfill it. Imagine going back to stop a disaster. Your intervention becomes the very cause of the disaster. You try to save someone, and your actions accidentally lead to their death. You try to prevent your birth, and end up ensuring it. In these closed loops, the past and future lock together like gears. Free will dissolves. Everything you do is scripted not by fate, but by causality in reverse. Philosophers struggle with its implications. But does the existence of time loops mean that choice is an illusion? That effort is futile. Or is it simply a different kind of freedom, one where knowing your destiny means choosing how to live within it? The Predestination Paradox doesn't offer comfort. It offers inevitability. A haunting mirror in which every struggle, every rebellion becomes part of the path you were always meant to walk. Level 100, Paradox of Paradox. What if the very act of seeking a paradox creates one? This is the paradox of paradox, a meta-riddle where the more you question reality, the more it twists into contradiction. Paradoxes expose gaps in logic, inconsistencies in thought, and boundaries of understanding. But what happens when the paradoxes themselves begin to multiply, interlock, and collapse into one another? If every paradox questions something, then the paradox of paradoxes questions the nature of questioning itself. Are paradoxes signs of deep truth or failures of thought? Do they reveal the universe's strangeness or our inability to grasp it? Can we escape paradox by redefining logic, or are we destined to circle endlessly in contradiction? This final paradox turns inward. It asks, is it possible to resolve paradoxes, or are they essential, built into the fabric of reason and being? The paradox of paradox reminds us that certainty is fragile, that knowledge, like time, can twist, and that the deepest truth may be this: the more we try to explain everything, the more we realize how little we can explain at all.